We're going to try to get started now. People are logging in online, and it's 1 minute after 8.
It didn't go very well.
Hello? Hello? I want to just put out a few reminders while we are getting ready to get started here. Consider it part of the code of conduct to speak up when you're asking questions, because we are getting feedback from our virtual participants that they can't hear so well when people are asking questions. When we give you the mic, speak loudly and clearly. Enunciate your words just to make sure that the online participants are having the same experience that you are, or at least as close as possible. So state your name also. That's really helpful for just getting to know each other. Just say who is speaking and then just be as loud and clear as possible. And I also want to say that we found a beautiful earring yesterday. If this belongs to anybody, I will leave it up here at the podium so you can come and get it. And we're going to start the morning off with our breakout summaries from Breakout 1 yesterday on regions. Jessica, perfect.
Okay, so I figured if I made it colorful, then it would look like we spent a lot of time on it. So some of the major gaps we've identified, as we discussed in the common room, was the data availability in the coastal ocean, and people made the point that there is data. It's also not as coordinated as big cruises in the open ocean. And so we spent a lot of time talking about this, so you'll see that's the main points. People ask for fair data. There's this principle of open access data. And people brought up the European system, where there is hard money positions, either within institutions or with the government, to help coordinate a database and help people that make a lot of observation, put their data into a standardized format and easily accessible for everyone. There was some point being made that different regions have different problems. So the Gulf of Maine, for instance, is shore alias, so we wanted to keep that in mind. And so the bottleneck for the research is this shelf and nearshore disconnect. And again, we need real-time observation and short-term forecast as well. So some of the solutions we came up with, or people said would be good. USGS was cited as a good example of an organization that has data available and how it's made available. The first point is hard money. If there are these positions where people do that for a living, then it's easier than to ask individual groups to coordinate at a higher level. And then some regional associations are very good at doing that, but there's not necessarily coordination within regional associations. Different programs may have different principles. And so if there was a higher level of coordination and less disparate databases, then people would also know where to put their data.
Hello, I'm here. So that was all really interesting. I wish I had been a part of the in-person talk, since we had a kind of similar but different conversation about the East Coast and Gulf of Mexico. We didn't have anybody from the Caribbean, which is unfortunate, because I think it would have been great to have that side's input. So we spent quite a bit of time talking about like the inherent lack of predictability, and that's in comparison to the West Coast, because the West Coast has this nice strong INSO signal, which I think drives a lot of the predictability, but we just don't have that same sort of climate variability on the East Coast. And so we highlighted a gap as better understanding these dominant modes of climate variability and climate signals, and it just didn't seem as strong as the West Coast. But I think an important point about that is that while the West Coast has this strong signal, I think that all regions kind of suffer from the same sort of like interannual variability that's just really difficult to predict because of more stochastic forcings like wind forcings. We also identified we need to better simulate the seasonal to interannual variability of the Gulf Stream, because it is a major force on the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico, that if we better understood that, we probably have a better understanding and better predictive capabilities for the ecological systems. So things along the lines of that would be meridional shifts to its main axis, and warm core and cold core rings are also very important. And just meandering intensity was also highlighted as a major gap in being able to predict ecology. And then things we thought would help fill in some of these gaps. So there are many projects right now, but higher resolution and biogeochemical model reanalysis models would help a lot in understanding some of the variability and forecasting abilities. Different statistical modeling techniques, and I think some of the discussion focused on looking at biological statistical modeling, just because, for example, the PDO was identified by Nate Mantua by looking at biological data. So there is this kind of backdoor way of looking at larger climate modes of variability by looking at the biological data. And I know that lots of people are doing this right now, but I think focusing on that would help out tremendously. And then the last group kind of identified this. There's lots of data, so the new machine learning techniques could help a lot in kind of sifting through the terabytes, petabytes of data that we have to maybe identify things that have so far eluded us otherwise. And then the last part is quantitative and qualitative. And this came up in our discussion about stakeholder engagement, because a lot of times stakeholders might not necessarily care so much about the quantitative side. So leveraging the qualitative to better, describe the forecast would be a useful sort of tool to, communicate these different forecasts. That pretty much sums it up. If anybody on this group, wants to fill in anything that I may have missed or mischaracterized, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Good morning. Thinking about the West Coast now, and sort of jumping right off of Brendan's point that the West Coast is easy, it is nice to have that big INSO signal as our main driver of predictability, but I think we also sort of acknowledge that it leads to some pitfalls sometimes. Specifically, that INSO diversity can drive different forms of teleconnections and have different impacts, and it can change the way that we predict things, potentially. And also that INSO teleconnections are not always consistent. They're not always going to look the same. There's a big spread in the way that INSO interacts with different parts of the physical and biogeochemical system. So we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about predictability. Just in general, we had a long discussion about needing a better understanding of eddy ecological interactions, both physics, timescales, the tools that we use to represent these different things in models or in observations. Wondering if we need to think more about eddy statistics versus individual eddies, whether we can even simulate an individual eddy, whether that's a useful thing to do. But also thinking about different flavors of eddies, not just closed ring systems, but filaments, bulk EKE, are these important tools that we need to be considering. We also sort of made this acknowledgement that it's very difficult, obviously, to simulate across trophic levels. And we can't really advance our models because we're often strongly limited by observation. So it's really hard to validate or advance the models further because we just don't have a ton of observations of these processes broaching different, moving across trophic levels. And then finally, we had some preliminary conversations that I think were wrought out in the broader discussion with Sam and Desiree's talks about working with stakeholders, and it was shockingly difficult to come up with examples of how models were used to make tangible decisions. So we just sort of acknowledged that there was general mistrust of models among stakeholders, and we were trying to think of best practices for how we might make models and operational tools more accessible to different stakeholders, and that includes building trust, as Sam has showed in her presentation very nicely yesterday, by repeatedly showing them stakeholders when it works, building up that familiarity into something that is tractable. And then finally, when developing operational tools, it's just important to remember to keep the stakeholders in mind and have them partner to really have a stake in creating these tools and making them useful for everybody. So yeah, not quite as organized into the questions, but this was our general conversation. Thanks.
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Apologies, I'm on my phone because my computer, JPL, decided to send us updates, so it is updating. So I'm glad I sent it to my phone. So sorry I'm not on camera, but we were the West Coast / Pacific Island virtual, but we realized that we didn't really have Pacific Island representation, so we didn't feel that we really could accurately convey their needs. So I just wanted to preface that realistically we were more US West Coast, and thus that's sort of how our questions and answer session went. So with respect to sort of what were the major gaps in our ability to predict physics, BGC, ecology in this region at the timescales of interest, we realized that we sort of need focused process studies linking the key physical mechanisms to ecological responses. We really identified a need for observations of rate processes, so birth, death, growth rate, with interactive variables. So basically with the environment, realizing that it's sort of a multi sort of complex issue, that it's not, just birth rate versus SST, it's birth rate versus SST with, I don't know, just throwing in another one, ocean acidification, things of that sort. Also the need for greater constraint on respiration, calcification, and dissolution rates. And overall, just for these different time series that we do have, making sure that they're consistent, that they continue, but they're spatially resolved with subsurface resolution. And then we identified that we need to do a better job with respect to sort of better integration of model development with observations, as well as better resolution of upstream transport variation and its effects on the coastal ocean. And Mark gave a great example with respect to sort of the influence of the circulation off Central America to North American coastal waters. So, I sort of lost my screen, sorry, there you go. So with respect to the programs that we designed to fill these gaps, we sort of, we didn't identify a program per se, but more so what you would think about when trying to design a program. And realistically, we realized for the US West Coast, we do have multiple different observing systems that are excellent, but we need better linkage between these disparate systems, and perhaps even an evaluation or reevaluation of these programs. Are they still in the right places? Are they collecting the right information? Could they be consistent measurements collected? Ocean informatics, so it's talking about sort of a common data serving platform as well as the metadata, et cetera, to make it easier, because we realize that that's sort of the biggest barrier. We can collect data, but realistically, most of the time for proposals, we say it's about 10% for data management, but realistically, it's more like 25%. And sometimes that's not sort of accounted for or accurately funded. And that's sort of the biggest part that could really help us with sort of tackling some of these issues and sort of getting the data that's out there for accessibility, for inclusion within models, et cetera. And then coming up with standardized best practices across collection and data processing for these observing systems. As well as better integration of shipboard with autonomous instrumentation for finer spatiotemporal resolution. And last, looking at the opportunity for sort of expanding collaborations or integrating efforts with colleagues in Central and South America and more broadly. So again, sort of filling in potentially that gap in transport observations from Central to North America. If anybody else is on the phone that was part of my group, Simone, Mark, Angelica, Laura, please voice in if there's anything else I missed.
So our group was for the Arctic, but we decided to include the Bering Sea in addition to the Arctic because the first part of the question was asking something about for the timescales needed, and we had to identify what were those important timescales, and really that depends on the application.
right now, these predictions would be used for fisheries. And there aren't commercial fisheries in the Arctic, but there are in the Bering Sea. And of course, there are indigenous fishings in the Arctic. So we kind of identified several gaps, and the ways that we might address them would be different based on those gaps. So one was the Eastern Bering Sea cold pool, being able to predict that. And there's some suspect that global model skill is the cause of not being able to fully capture this cold pool or predict the cold pool because of the winter winds that are important for forcing, particularly the winds that are driving advection from the north to the south. Also thinking about sea ice concentration and thickness. We saw in a talk yesterday that observations of volume were important. So we want programs that continue and improve upon these observations, like Cryosat-2 and ICESat-2 for sea ice thickness. Another gap in prediction is sea ice phenology, so the timing of sea ice arrival and sea ice retreat in parts of the Bering Sea, because it impacts the biogeochemistry and ecology in that region. So we need sustained observations in the northern Bering. So there's been a lot of observations in the southern Bering Sea, but with warming and the sea ice retreat, we see these shifts in organisms to the northern Bering. And there are fewer observations there. They've started more recently, so we just need to make sure we continue those. Another huge gap for prediction in this area is river input. There are lots of rivers that go into the Arctic. So we need to think about the volume of fresh water that goes in, and also the delivery of nutrients and carbon and products related to the carbonate system. And data availability is definitely the issue here. There are some new reanalysis products available, such as GLOFAST and JRA55DO, as well as Global News. For the US side, we have USGS, but thinking about the Arctic, we really need this international partnership about getting all these data in one place. What other programs would we design here? Well, EcoFoci and the Distributed Biological Observatory have been making observations in the Arctic, so we need sustained time series from these different programs, but also we can always increase those observations, particularly by adding funding for this international collaboration in the Arctic. That's it. Thanks.
Right, so let's move to fisheries. We discussed, we focused on what the major barriers are for getting this forecast being used by stakeholders. And one was, which I think was covered a little bit by the West Coast group, was the lack of understanding of the mechanistic underpinnings. So just the need for more process studies linking the physics, biogeochemistry to upper trophic levels. And then one big thing was just the inherent inertia of the fisheries management process and the whole stock assessment process, just scientists being used to doing things as they've always done, as well as managers. And then for fisheries data, I guess we were comparing differences between fisheries data and physical, maybe even biogeochemical data, where when you're looking at a fish stock, you don't really have a good idea of what the biomass might actually be. So you have these indices of abundance. And so there's not really a good point of comparison, and there is often no data to validate your fisheries model with, apart from these indices of abundance, which is quite different from what folks are used to on the physical side of things. And then in terms of suggestions, just stressing the reforecasting approach to fisheries, which is not very much used. So stock assessment, really think about developing this stock assessment which is close to a reanalysis, but they're not really thinking about reforecasting, and maybe they should do that more. Also, understanding, it's important to be able to understand the current process and the current tools in terms of ecological tools, stock assessment methods, to really make improvements on what the current weaknesses are, and then getting those adopted. So that's one big thing. And then we also, there was a lot of discussion on, it's not just the stock assessment, but there's many other ways that these forecasts can be useful to the management process. And so thinking more about what those other uses might be, maybe it's the ecosystem status report. That might be a good place to start with, that Sam showed yesterday. And just moving more towards having proactive rather than reactive management in terms of other uses other than stock assessment. One use could be, as we saw yesterday, in-season adaptive management approaches using these forecasts. Thank you.
Aaron, are you there?
Yep.
Okay.
Hello. So we were the virtual fisheries group. And one of the things that we first talked about is essentially related to the barriers for the management. And it kind of cascades down into the accuracy of the forecasts and making the forecasts more accurate. And the topic was essentially that the accuracy or the uncertainty of the model inputs cascades into our forecasts. And so essentially we would need more accurate model inputs and model forcing to improve the accuracy of our forecasts for fisheries applications. And the example was winds in the Bering Sea and ice that I think someone touched on earlier. And that improving the winds will improve the ice forecasts, which improves the ecological forecasts and makes them more applicable for fisheries. Except that the Bering Sea winds are not part of essentially R as a group forecast, and so there's not a lot that we can do about them. And I think this can be generalized to all sorts of different model inputs, be it river inputs, winds in other places, general meteorology, and things like that. And simply a better understanding of all our model inputs to make things better would make them more relevant for management. And then we also talked about how there's kind of a lack of a first principles approach to ecology. There's not really, physics equations for ecology that are as kind of physics laws as there actually are for physical oceanography. And that this can result in the use of correlated models in kind of the ecological standpoint. And these may not forecast very well when you're outside the training data that they were developed for. But we also talked about that the correlative models may work well if you can exploit persistence that may be there. So you may have a strong year class, you may have a high biomass that can persist for years to come, and that can kind of help and make your ecological forecasting actually maybe a little bit more accurate if you can exploit that persistence. And then we also talked about kind of merging the methods and data and things like that, which is considering, evaluating, I've kind of got it in quotes here, as discipline-specific approaches. And the idea is that oftentimes we can kind of get a little bit, stay in our comfort zone, use the methods and analysis that we've used before, and end up a little bit siloed. And there may be other disciplines out there that are using other methods, statistics, numerical approaches, whatever it be, that could be applied to our forecasts that we're just not used to using. And so the discussion was a little bit, we may benefit from just getting out of our comfort zone and seeing what fisheries scientists are using, what physical scientists are using, what meteorological scientists are using, and see if some of their approaches translate well and are actually better than what we're doing. And then along the data needs, we talked a bit about understanding zooplankton, and additional zooplankton data can help improve the ecological models. I think that we can also generalize zooplankton to simply be prey, whether it be zooplankton or forage fish. And in our habitat modeling or even abundance modeling, that prey is often missing or very poorly constrained in the forecasting. So having a better understanding of how zooplankton or prey in general translates up the food chain can give us a better understanding of actually forecasting fisheries. And then we thought it would also be beneficial to make more efforts to merge data sets that are already collected. So instead of designing a big new data collection, which is always nice and always helpful, kind of co-locating data from different agencies, different institutions, and creating kind of larger, more robust data sets from a number of smaller data collection efforts. And then, similar to the discipline-specific approaches ideas, start to consider emerging approaches like machine learning techniques or AI when designing or redesigning data collection efforts, and try and think about how the data collection efforts can be integrated into some of these newer machine learning techniques and things like that. It's a little bit along the lines of also, instead of doing the status quo, think about how some of these emerging technologies or emerging techniques could help shape our data collection so that we can get the most information out of it. And I think that's a high-level summary of what we discussed.
Yes. HEPs.
Good morning, everyone. We had a very interesting discussion on harmful algal blooms yesterday. So one of the central points we discussed was like the major barrier to prediction for management relevant applications. So all the points we discussed were kind of linked to this central point. And the first thing, so again, like this is a very brief summary, of course, but the first point is like the inherent lack of species level predictability. What do I mean with that? Like, because, not harmful algal blooms, they come with like non-linearities, and this may result in chaotic behavior. So this means that your system may be very sensitive, hypersensitive to your initial conditions. And that's why it can be very challenging to forecast harmful algal blooms. So this was the first interesting point we discussed. A second point was on data. It was also already discussed in like presented in previous slides. So although we have a lot of data available, it's still data is often like the bottleneck to forecast harmful algal blooms. So we discussed this, but there is some optimism. For example, we discussed the potential of remote sensing using drones. So this kind of techniques. And also like more advanced instruments like EBS gliders that we could like deploy on a large scale. But we were also aware that this may be very costly. And the last point was like the usage of eDNA. Then a third point was on the mechanistic understanding of harmful algal blooms. Because we saw like yesterday, there are a lot of like empirical models, but often they're used like a black box. But to construct these models, you need insight into your system. So we discussed this, so we need some like mechanistic understanding. Sometimes we even do not understand why harmful algal blooms disappear, for example. And it's also linked to a previous presentation, the discussion on zooplankton. So we discussed this as well. And also linked to the mechanistic understanding, like we discussed the translation of your harmful algal blooms to toxins. Because in the end, stakeholders, they're often interested in toxins, not really in like the concentration of the harmful algae. So this is also very, very challenging. And then the last point, it's also linked to stakeholders and communicating the research to the stakeholders, because stakeholders, they often prefer to really measure in the field and use like a measurement to, as a basis for managing a system. Because when modeling, they may be a little bit afraid to use like the output of a model for managing a system. So how do we communicate this? And how do we search for a balance of using insights provided by a model compared to not using these insights? Because this may also be quite risky if you do not listen to the output of a model. So how to find search for this balance. So yeah, this was a very brief summary of what we discussed. And yes, thank you for your attention.
Okay, we move to what Christina, please.
So our discussion was about mostly OA and oxygen predictions. And so we divided it in like long-term and short-term and some of the challenges and solutions that we can have for this. So for OA, for example, we need to have better characterization of the indirect pathways that could affect ocean acidification in a certain space. We need long time series. That's a challenge for everyone and everything you want to do, actually, like that you need enough data in the same place so that you can do something with it. And also, some of the discussion is how to motivate stakeholders to worry about the long time scale. So one example, for example, was that, say, you can convince fishermen that like to worry about what's going to happen by the end of the century. But if you say, okay, a scallop lives for 20 years, that's only 4 generations by the end of the century. So that might be a way to talk to people to get them motivated about caring about what's happening in the long term. For a short-term forecast, we talked about having real-time PCO2 data and new methods to get good alkalinity data that doesn't require all the boring titration that's like harder to do. And we talked about some of the citizen science and having non-scientists collect the data, and that's easier to do with physics. So you can send a CTD on a fishing boat, and they can do that. But a lot of the biogeochemical sensors are more finicky, so that's a challenge to translate that to BGC. On the oxygen long term, we need improved terrestrial inputs from watershed models, and perhaps maybe Earth system models can help with some of that. And about the need to get more shelf data, because a lot of the times you have very coastal data, you have marsh data, you have something that's like really, really close to the coast, and then you have ocean data, and there's that space in between that that can lack some data, and that's really hard if you have like a model boundary that's around that area, that you end up introducing biases to your coastal area because you're relying on ocean data, open ocean data that doesn't really reflect what's happening there. And little information on benthic fluxes and shallow coastal environments and how those will change with warming. So we need better benthic parametrizations to be able to capture the fluxes there. And then on the oxygen short-term forecast, there's this trade-off between knowing things now and getting the reasons right for the understanding. So we talk a lot about machine learning. It's like, oh, it could be a black box. We don't know what's happening, but sometimes that gets the job done. So just being mindful of the different tools that we have and how to apply and like how they can work. There can be works in parallel to to predict things, but also to try to understand how they work. And building models that are more versatile because stakeholders may have new focuses or issues, or some problem may already be solved. So Margie gave an example that they wanted to think nitrate data or something, and then you work on building something that is going to require that, and then they come back and say, well, actually, we'd like to have the salinity data. It's like, well, you could have told me that a few years ago, and we'd have that ready. So just some of the things that we talked about, some problems. So we try to come up with what's the problem, but also think of some of the solutions that we can apply to that.
Okay, so either Michelle or Brendan.
Hello again, it's Brendan.
Okay.
So we had a very small conversation. It was just 3 of us in the room, or the virtual room, which made it kind of interesting. But we did represent at least a partial swath of the regions that are of interest. So I work in the Gulf of Mexico, and Michelle works in the Gulf of Mexico, but also the West Coast, and then Darren works in the Arctic. So we had some cross section of areas. But some of the things we talked about is that they're under development, but they're at the moment there's a lack of high resolution and like 1 kilometer, for example, biogeochemical models, because we start talking about hypoxia, for example, like you really need a really fine scale resolution to resolve some of these processes, which, I say that, but Sam gave a good example of in the Northwest, they're over predicting anoxia even with their 1 kilometer model. So there's a big gap and right there. Also, we talked a lot about like paucity of consistent space and time coastal data to assimilate into models. And a good example of this comes from the Arctic, where there's this large region that is, under very interested in by many people, but there's a lack of a lot of good data and consistent data to really drive models and forecasting any sort of, variable. We also talked a little bit about the inherent lack of predictability at timescales, sub-seasonal timescales, and that's true for pretty much any system we're talking about. And that one good example is sea ice in the Arctic, which some people have talked about today already, that it's driven mainly by winds, or that's a huge forcing, and winds are really hard to predict. Also, we spent a bit of time talking about engagement with stakeholders and communication, because it is an iterative process where you produce a product and then go to the stakeholder and say, well, that's not what we want. But this is something that is very important, and I think that we should be cognizant of any process or product that we're producing from the get-go. It shouldn't be an afterthought, I think, is the main point we are trying to get across, is that it really should be in the forefront of any researcher from the, and thinking about these sort of forecasts. Also, another barrier is there's disparate methodological approaches. So I'm thinking about hypoxia, where there's lots of complex biogeochemical models, and they all are relatively similar, but they are also very different too. And if you are starting a project from the ground up, you really have to consider, like, do you have the resources to actually run a really complex model, particularly in computation time? So maybe a trade-off with that is maybe a more simple model that gets you closer to at least producing some forecast and moving the ball forward. And the last point I think is really important that I don't think gets talked a lot about, and that's turf waters, which is unfortunate that it happens that egos get involved, where we are all competing for limited resources, funding resources, right? And that sometimes people don't want to work with each other for various reasons that has to do with ego. And I think that these barriers need to get broken down more and more. Open science leads towards progress, and ultimately there's a societal benefit to that when people swallow their egos and actually behave as professionals. And with that, if anyone else that was in that group wants to chime in, please do so. But thank you.
Hi, in the breakout session on marine ecosystem health, we talked about compound and extreme events. It was a hybrid session. There were a lot of us, and we had a really good discussion. And some of the major barriers to prediction that we discussed for management relevant applications are just the lack of data. We need more physical and biogeochemical data. We need to measure more of the features of compound and extreme events. We need to double down on the current sampling that we're doing. So we're undersampling, especially subsurface subsamples. And we also talked about the lack of rapidly available data for quick assimilation into models. And also, I think this echoes a lot of what other people have been saying in other sessions, is that there's a lack of this basic mechanistic understanding of biogeochemical processes, and also the organisms, what their physical tolerances are. And then we also talked about the inherent lack of predictability. Things like the relevant timescales are difficult to constrain when it comes to trying to define a compound or extreme event. And we also talked about the nonlinear behavior of physics and ecosystems. Even if the physical forcing is linear, you can get these large nonlinear biological responses. And it's also really difficult to constrain just the second and third order interactions between drivers of compound events. We talked about like land-ocean interactions. We talked about multivariable interactions, such as precipitation and hypoxia. And then we also had a discussion about the relevant processes. Some of the physical processes that we thought were relevant were longshore upwelling, favorable winds, transient storms that cause mixing, and coastally trapped waves. And as for biotic factors, something we talked about was the organismal generation time. And this is important because it sets the time scale for relevant phenomenon when it comes to compound events. And of course, there's lots of biogeochemical processes, like that have been mentioned today, ocean acidification, hypoxia, and then we talked about the data, and there's a lot of hope in a lot of promise in all of the satellite ocean color measurements that we take in the upcoming SWOT, PACE, and ISAR. Mentions. Someone mentioned the high-res ocean reanalyses tools such as GLORIS are quite useful. People talk about future observations of surface fluxes, winds, and currents, and measurements of mixed layer depth that could all add benefit. And then we talked about suitable methodological approaches at the end. We need more multi-stressor experiments, right? We need to move beyond just looking at one variable and look at how variables interact with each other. Someone also mentioned that large ensembles could be used more liberally to get more degrees of freedom. And we also talked about linear inverse models, which were mentioned yesterday, because they can tease out key processes. And we also talked about how dynamical models might be better able to explain extreme events. So we're kind of talking about what dynamical models can offer and what statistical models can offer when it comes to teasing out the causes of compound and extreme events.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, both for the discussions yesterday and for the reports. So for sake of time, we are going to not ask questions right now, and we're going to move to the oral session. And again, since we are a little late, we are going to hold questions also for the discussion afterwards. So we're not going to take questions just after each talk.
Okay, so now we move to the session 3, that is about modeling capabilities and challenges. And our first speaker is Matt Long from Ncar and University of Colorado.
I'm actually not affiliated with the University of Colorado, but close enough. I know. There was an error in the program. That's okay. So I'm going to start with this image, and this is to remind me to mention a few things. The first of which is just that it's really a pleasure to be in a room full of people again, and talking to an audience where it's possible to sort of have a two-way exchange. The other thing is that I feel fortunate to be a scientist and to have the opportunity to contemplate the function of our planetary system. And the thing that I'm really excited about in the context of the topic of this workshop really is the potential for actionable prediction to actually impact people's lives. And a lot of the time I've spent as a scientist is on these theoretical, sort of long time scale problems. And I think it's really exciting and really compelling to pull it back and to think about prediction and actionable prediction as kind of a revolutionary way to impact society and to affect the trajectory of our planet. I'm going to talk today about results that are attributable to a large number of people, but I just wanted to highlight a few of the key people here before I begin, and then I'm going to begin. So here's an important context for the conversation today. This is a figure from the recent IPCC report that came out just a few weeks ago, actually, and shows the trajectory of future climate in the context of global mean surface temperature on the left, and then the burning embers diagram, which is this probability assessment of severe impacts in a variety of categories. We stand at an inflection point in history where action now yields a progressively smaller arc as we delay. And so it is critical that we engage in sustainable management of the natural resources, including mitigating climate change, but also to protect resources in the marine environment. One of our most powerful tools at the planetary scale in this context are Earth system models. And Earth system models comprise these holistic dynamic hypotheses for the collective function of the biosphere in the context of a dynamic climate system. They're built at a process level, and then the processes are coupled together to yield descriptions of the emergent behavior of planetary scale function. One of the things we've learned from Earth system models is the climate system is highly dynamic. And so what I'm showing you here is a results from the CESM 1, the Community Earth System Model version 1, large ensemble integration. And these are basically, order 30 equally plausible projections of 50-year trends in ocean oxygen concentrations at 200 meters in the North Pacific. And so what you can see here is that there is a diversity of behavior. We can introduce some formalism here, and on the left, I've just picked out two of those ensemble members and shown you the total trend, and then broken that down into a deterministic component, the response to the forcing, which is the average across the ensemble. That's on the far right. That's the forced response to rising CO2 in the atmosphere. And you see that that yields a decline in oxygen in the thermocline in the North Pacific. But then in the center, there is the component of oxygen variability on this 50-year timescale attributable to natural processes, right? And so what we can see is that dynamics, intrinsic variability in the climate system has the capacity to generate meaningful changes over the next several decades that will impact significant differences in outcome. And so here is sort of the diversity then of that natural response in the context of this climate model simulation. Well, some component of that natural variability is predictable, and that has motivated a community of people to begin running initialized predictions with Earth system models to enable such predictions on the global scale. And so this field of, quote, decadal, unquote, prediction has emerged as a major emphasis in the context of the Earth system modeling enterprise internationally. So what does it mean to initialize an Earth system model? Well, the components of the Earth system contain or comprise different memory on different timescales, and really critically, this implies a focus on the ocean, which has the longest memory of the components of the climate system. What is prediction in the context of a forced trend? Well, this is illustrated here. So we can imagine that the climate system has some variability represented by the orange spread and some trend, in this case an anthropogenic trend attributable to rising greenhouse gases, with some mean value that has a secular trend over time represented by the red line. Our ability to generate initialized forecasts shown in the green ensemble, our ability to distinguish those forecasts from this background trend relies on our statistical capacity to distinguish the green ensemble from this background envelope of variability. And ultimately, there's two processes that limit the predictability due to the chaotic dynamics. One is that the initial conditions wash out, and so you sort of return to the background state. Another is that the magnitude of the forcing basically pushes the system out away from the information content available in the initial condition. Here are some results from a recent paper documenting the Decadal climate prediction project. So this is a component of the coupled model intercomparison effort, and the indication from these analyses are that there is the potential for significant skill. These are retrospective forecasts of temperature, precipitation, and sea level pressure by row there. And what you see is that there is significant predictability in, for instance, temperature. A large component of that predictability comes from the forcing, and so the plot on the top left there is basically 100% predictable, but a huge proportion of that comes from supplying the model with the boundary conditions associated with rising CO2. If you pull that component of the predictability out of the equation, you're left with the plot, the column on the right, and that shows the predictability that's directly attributable to the initialization of the model. And so what we see is that there is large predictability, and I should mention that these are on the 2 to 9 year time horizon. So this is a significant capacity, but requires a very large ensemble of model solutions to generate. There is a sort of growing movement in the literature to use initialized Earth system prediction to assess ocean biogeochemical and ecological questions. This is just a subset of the papers that are available now, and I think this field is growing, and our community is starting to mature and be able to use these resources for questions of interest to this community here. What I'm going to talk about today is really focused on the prediction experiments that we've done at Ncar, and these comprise sort of 2.5 generations of models. The first is the CCSM4 Decadal prediction experiment, then a Decadal prediction large ensemble, the DPLE, the SMILE, which is the seasonal to multi-year large ensemble, which is a prediction framework we just generated quite recently, and then a high-resolution Decadal prediction ensemble. The details of the initialization procedures I don't have time to go into here, but suffice to say that the majority of the effort has been focused on initializing the ocean, with some attention to the land and atmosphere in the later generations as well. The three leftmost columns are nominally coarse resolution, 1 degree resolution integrations, where the high res is about a 1/10 of a degree. It's a 1/10 degree ocean and about 1/4 degree atmosphere. So just to highlight a few results or sort of aspects of these solutions. These are results from the CCSM4 Decadal prediction experiment showing heat content in the North Atlantic subpolar gyre. And the plot on the top illustrates the time evolution of heat content in the hindcast. This was the data set used for initialization in the black line. And then the flagella are each of the ensemble mean of the coupled model forecasts, right? And so a critical thing to recognize in this context is that the coupled model has a very different attractor than the observations. And so when you put the heat content reconstruction into this coupled model, it wants to go back to its happy place. And so there's a requirement to basically correct for that difference in mean state. And that's what's been done on the plot on the bottom. That correction step entails taking a lead year dependent climatology, computing that across all the forecast start dates, and removing that component of the signal from those coupled model integrations so that you can see the anomaly structure evolve. So that's a detail in the context of this procedure. Here's another phenomena that is of significant concern in the context of these experiments. And this is an example of something called initialization shock, where we take a field generated using observations and initialize the coupled model. In this case, these decadal prediction experiments were initialized with this wind product in the in the equatorial Pacific, which has a spurious trend and this sort of overly aggressive easterly flow in the observation, quote unquote, observations that we use to initialize the model basically yields this rebound effect, such that the early start dates in this period each have a tendency to generate spurious El Nino events. So this is an example of initialization shock. I mentioned earlier that large ensembles are required to recover predictable signals, and here's an example of that where this is now from the Decadal prediction large ensemble experiment, where we're able to recover skill in forecasting Sahel rainfall, but that skill, in order to beat persistence, requires order 35 to 40 members. And that's really a manifestation of the idea that a predictable signal can be broken down, a predictable signal or a model simulation can be broken down into a component associated with the predictable signal and a noise component. And so when you integrate an ensemble integration, basically it's this 1 over the square root of n reduction in the noise averaging across the ensemble that enables that predictive signal to be discerned. We have biogeochemistry in some of these later integrations, and here's just an example of the predictability in net primary productivity, for instance, as a function of lead year here, and then the enhancement in the skill associated with net primary productivity above persistence. A lot of this predictability is owing to our ability to predict nutrient convergence in the surface layer on these timescales. Here's another example of sort of an ecologically relevant predictive property. This is data from, or an analysis by Riley Brady during his PhD work, showing the predictability of pH anomalies in the California current region from the Decadal prediction large ensemble, and just demonstrating that there is significant predictability even out to 5-year lead times, and that predictability exceeds the predictive capacity of persistence. This predictability it basically owes to our capacity to generate or to track anomalies in the ocean DIC field and have those anomalies arrive sort of downstream. Here's another example of that type of phenomenon operation. This is showing predictability or anomaly skill score correlation coefficients as a function of lead year by column, and then relative to persistence and an uninitialized forecast by row. This is the anomaly, oxygen anomalies on the 26.5 isopycnal. So, for instance, in the thermocline depths in the North Pacific, a lot of this predictability is associated with basically anomalies generated in the thermocline that we can then, that the prediction system is capable of advecting and tracking downstream. We see some indication of that process here, for instance, is a correlation of oxygen with potential vorticity, illustrating the role of ventilation processes in generating oxygen anomalies. Once those oxygen anomalies are in the solution, then the prediction system is capable of tracking them. So that was oxygen. If we want to think about ecologically relevant quantities, we can go a step further, and this is kind of one potential framework to do so. This is using the metabolic index that Curtis Deutsch and colleagues have developed, just basically delineating regions in partial pressure of oxygen and temperature state space that are habitable in the context of the metabolic index from those that are uninhabitable. And so, casting predictions in the context of a directly physiological relevant quantity has some power in that regard. I'm going to skip through the rest of these results relatively quickly, but this is just prediction results that illustrate some of the seasonal dynamics and the barriers to prediction that arise, for instance, in winter as a function of different large marine ecosystems. These results echo those of Park and Charlie Stock's work, illustrating the role of wintertime, the emergence of wintertime nutrient anomalies in driving prediction. I think it's worth pointing out that behind the scenes here is a replete biogeochemical model that has the capacity to represent shifts in the partitioning of energy in the ecosystem. And so here, for instance, are predictions of the diatom fraction, the export ratio, and the particulate flux that enable, some mechanistic information to be discerned about ecosystem quantities. And then finally, in this vein, we're working with Colleen and Sam Sidlecki to implement a feisty, a fish functional type model in your system modeling framework to basically generate this end-to-end predictive framework where we can actually simulate fish and the two-way feedbacks of fish with the biogeochemical processes. So those are all results at low res. For the last few minutes of the talk, I'd just like to discuss some emerging results from our high resolution prediction system. Some of the reasons that we might want to go to high resolution are obvious to the people in this room here, one of which is just the fidelity, process level fidelity that high resolution buys you. And this is just an illustration of that from the California current system showing the strong eddying effect that is present at high res but not at low res. Here are some results from our collaborators at Texas A&M showing the SST, the predictability of SST at a 1-year lead time in this high-res decadal prediction experiment. There's some exciting results indicating that tropical cyclones are predictable, or the frequency of tropical cyclones is predictable 1 year in advance. I think one of the most exciting aspects of this high-res prediction system, though, relates to something that Mike Alexander mentioned yesterday, which is the signal-to-noise paradox. And that's illustrated in this plot here, that there tends to be a phenomena wherein models have a greater skill in predicting the real world than they do in predicting themselves. And so this lower blue line here is basically taking a prediction system and asking it to predict the evolution of a single member of the ensemble of that prediction system. And paradoxically, it seems, the capability to predict, for a model to predict itself is lower, the skill is lower than the model predicting the observations. There's a way to sort of formalize, so what does high res have to do? I mean, I mentioned earlier this sort of ensemble averaging yielding and a capacity to damp down the noise and allow signals to emerge. Here is a plot showing the high resolution to low resolution variance ratio in SST and turbulent heat flux. And so, one might imagine that introducing an eddying model into a prediction system is going to generate more noise and make the problem worse. But looking at the structure of coupling dynamics indicates that there's basically a fundamentally different way that information is being transmitted in a fundamentally different way in eddying solutions. And so what these plots show is the correlation between latent heat flux and SST in an observationally based product at the top, a high resolution version in the middle, and a low resolution version of CESM on the bottom. And so what you see, the left is with the heat flux with SST, and the right is the heat flux with the SST tendency. And so what we see basically is that there's these large regions of positive correlation in the extratropics in the eddying model that are showing that the eddying solution is driving atmospheric dynamics, and they're completely absent at low resolution. So we can devise this, or others in the literature have devised this quantity called the ratio of predictable components, which is basically a measure of the signal to noise ratio, or the predictable variance relative to the total variance. And that ratio is the ratio of the predictable variance to the total variance in the observations divided by that in the model. If that ratio is 1, that's sort of a perfect prediction system. If it's greater than 1, it's the signal-to-noise paradox, right? The model signal-to-noise ratio is too weak. It can predict the odds better than it can predict itself. And so it's been a long-standing issue that prediction systems have these ratio of predictable components that are greater than 1. So here's just to wrap up some results showing anomaly skill correlations from the high-res prediction system at the top with 10 members and a comparable field. This is for wintertime sea level pressure, a comparable ACC plot from a 40-member DPLE. And so the first thing to note here is that the high-res system can generate comparable skill as the low-res system with a much smaller ensemble. So that square root of n average, 1 over the square root of n averaging is less critical. And indeed, if we look now at the bottom row here, this is a plot showing the ratio of predictable components in the high and low res solution. What we see is actually this high res system is a much less noisy system. And so the indication here is that the mesoscale dynamics likely in the ocean are capable of basically taking these initialized signals and communicating them in meaningful ways that engender predictable signal. Okay, sometimes it stops responding. Okay, so that was sort of a fire hose-like discussion. I just want to wrap up with a few closing thoughts. The first relates to the idea that that in the modeling world we have this capacity to construct our own reality, and the analogy here is that of Plato's cave, where if you imagine this small group of people chained to the wall in a cave, looking at shadows, their whole reality is comprised of the shadows on the wall. And so, as modelers, we always need to be aware that we have these replete fields that we're simulating, but particularly in the context of the ecosystem dynamics, it's really critical for us to be able to have observational data sets that span the scales of interest. And so, if you go to a particular estuary or a particular coastal system, it's often possible to compile data sets that help you validate model solutions. We really struggle at the global scale to develop synthetic products that enable us to validate solutions at those scales. Another final point here relates to just some of the operational challenges associated with doing research in this space. And for the purposes of illustration, I'm just showing here the math that leads to the data volume of a single field from the CSM1 coarse resolution large ensemble, right? So, a 3D monthly field comprises about 2 terabytes of data. And so the computational challenge of doing something as simple as computing the mean is non-trivial. And I think that deserves significant recognition in the context of this community because it poses a significant barrier to entry. It slows us down in terms of doing our science, and ultimately enables us to be less effective. And so what I just want to point out here is several initiatives that I happen to be involved with. One is this Earth System Data Science Initiative at Ncar, where we've recognized that observations and models and computing infrastructure are really sort of a foundational element in our capacity to do actionable science. But we need to couple that with communities of practice focused on other aspects, in particular data analysis and computing workflows that lead to extracting meaningful information from model solutions. The other community efforts are Pangeo, which is a community focused on big data and analytical workflows. Project Pythia, which is an EarthCube project I'm involved in, that is focused on education. And so if you want to learn sort of big data analysis tools in the Python ecosystem, that's a great place to go. And then finally, a new science and technology center at Columbia that's focused on using machine learning in the context of Earth system models. So I realize I've gone a little over time here, so presume we'll hold discussion until after.
Our next speaker is Mr. Drenkard from NOAA.
This is my summary. Don't look. That's it.
All right, good morning. My name is Liz Drenkard. I am a research oceanographer at NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, and the last time I was up here presenting was my thesis defense 7 years ago. So a lot's happened in 7 years. I've had a complete kind of change and shift in my career path. I'd like to start off discussions about downscaling with this image of the Scripps Pier. It's a photo by Douglas Alden at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I like this picture in part because my postdoc advisor, Art Miller, always starts his talks with pictures of the Scripps Pier, so I figure I have to do the same. But what I think it illustrates is the need for this downscaling effort. So we've got the Scripps Pier here, and it's kind of a convenient little scale bar for us, about 1/4 of a kilometer. And this black ribbon that you see along the coast is schooling anchovy. And what I appreciate about this illustration is it kind of shows us that our living marine ecosystems are interacting and behaving on scales that are smaller than what we have with our Earth system models. So to really get at the features that are impacting them, we want to be looking at those higher resolution scales. So this is a very simplistic definition of dynamical downscaling. It's how I think of it. It's a lot like our Earth system models, our general circulation models. We have these many points where we're solving for these equations of state or these thermodynamics and fluid mechanic equations, but rather than having this big general circulation model, this big domain, it's condensed into a smaller area. Now, a more logistical perspective, I like to think of it like baking. So you've got a recipe. This is an example from my Northeast Pacific domain about how I'm going to configure it. You compile it all together, you throw it on a machine, you hope it doesn't blow up. And then at the end, you have a product that you dress up and you present, maybe take some slices of. So this is just, I'm not actually talking about this today, but it's what I'm working on, Northeast Pacific ocean downscaling hindcast. So most of my work is actually from the perspective of climate change assessments. So in terms of applying this to forecasting systems, there may be a very different body of research to consider. So just please keep that in mind, that where I'm coming from is from that particular perspective. So why we downscale? What we want is to be looking at these living marine resource critical features. And what we have here is an example of 2 studies where on the left is the climate change signal from the global or the general circulation model, the coarser resolution product. And on the right is the downscale result for the end of century conditions. And what I want to point out with the Liu et al. Study on the top is this cooler signal in the Central American seas that we resolve. And then also in the Sun et al., we have these current systems off of Australia, which, if you notice the order of magnitude difference in this change. So it's not only these features that might be important for the organisms that live there, but it's also reflecting back on the larger scale trend that we're seeing in these locations. Now, dynamical versus statistical, hopefully this is not too inflammatory of a statement, but the dynamical models sort of allow us to look and simulate unprecedented ocean states. So if you think about the statistically derived or observationally derived statistical downscaling, that is based on states that we've already seen and that we've already experienced. So if you were to have a regime shift or fundamental change in our ocean system, it's possible that the statistical models couldn't anticipate that if you're projecting out on long timescales. Now, if someone doing statistical modeling would like to chime in and let me know that that's not the case, I appreciate that. I don't want to sell them short, but that was my impression for the benefit of one versus the other. So what can we do with dynamical downscaling? It's a lot. It's pretty cool. I'm not going to go into these specifically, but these are some of the things I geek out about. We can couple it to the atmosphere. We can do unstructured stretch grids. We can do data simulations. We can put biogeochemical models in it. It's great. This is an example of the cobalt model where we've got 33 tracers. You can go nuts. But there's a very real factor to take into account, and that's the computational cost for all of these things. So you have to take into account the size of your domain, the resolution, how much complexity it has, what you're using at the boundaries, one-way versus two-way nested, all these different choices that we make add to that computational cost. And when we say computational cost, it's not just the production of those simulations, it's also the cost of storing that data, analyzing that data, and then also serving it up to the general public. And if you're not a research institution like GFDL or Ncar, those are very real limitations on what you can accomplish. So I'm thinking about like what Clarissa was showing yesterday with the different sea harm and forecasts, and everything said limitation, limitation. I'm like, no, that's just pragmatism. It's what you have to do in order to get these things done and get them out there. So to navigate these different trade-offs that we have to take into account, sort of an example of what can come out of one of these workshops, we put together a synthesis paper where we looked at different climate change downscaling studies. So emphasizing again, this is with a climate change focus, so that's at the multi-decadal end of Desiree's adapted Stommel diagram for fisheries purposes. But what we ended up with this paper is we came up with a protocol. Essentially, what are the different steps you want to take or consider when you're designing a living marine resource dedicated downscaling experiment? And the idea being to make the most of limited computational resources. So in that synthesis study, we looked at over 100 downscaling approaches, or different ways of different studies in different areas. And what we generally found as an overview, there are more people doing downscaling over time. We've seen an increase in the horizontal resolution. There are more studies including biogeochemistry, and more people are using ensemble members. So all of these are showing over time. The number of studies should be the n value that are in these bars here. And then a fraction of the studies that include these different parameters. So the BGC modules, including higher resolution. So generally speaking, we're seeing this trend towards a recognition of the importance of resolution, that we need to be covering a lot of the uncertainty in these studies, and that we have more comprehensive models. However, a lot of these are this sort of proof of concept in the sense that it's like, we can do this, and we did it, but they're not really being used as operational forecasting systems. So that's kind of one of the big challenges I would put forward, and this is really echoing what Charlie was talking about yesterday and kind of elaborating on that. In order to provide this information, we want to be exploring that uncertainty space and really providing a sense of the probability and the range of possible futures. So with the studies that we looked at, this is now looking at the total number of studies that we were assessing and the number of ensemble members that they included for future conditions. A lot of them are looking at less than 5 ensemble members, which is arguably not really enough to fully explore that full envelope of uncertainty. So we want to be strategic in how we design these experiments, and part of that might actually entail looking at options for modeling outside of dynamical downscaling. So I'm going to kind of wrap up looking at a very common figure of the different types of uncertainty. So this is the Hawkins and Sutton, looking at the time horizons. So looking, depending on where you are, thinking about uncertainty or the variability you want to sample, you ideally would be sampling in these areas that have a greater width or a lot more space to them. So as you go farther out in time, you see that it could be the model itself, the scenario, or that internal variability that Matt was talking about. So looking at, Mike Jaycox made this figure of the California current marine ecosystem. Some of that uncertainty will change based on the variable you're looking at. So this is looking at the global models, not the regional models. But in the case of sea surface temperature, the dominant source of uncertainty is that scenario. So where we end up with our greenhouse gas emission scenario. In contrast, if we're looking at the primary production, we end up with model uncertainty dominating that signal. So now it's a question of, okay, which models are we downscaling? So when we made that recommendation for our synthesis paper, it was, okay, if you had to choose just 4 models that can downscale, span that range of possible futures. So this is a plot from Barb Mulling's paper, where she downscaled or was using different projections for looking at conditions in the Chesapeake Bay And it was, how do you span that range of possible futures? So they opted to look at models that span the space of how much precipitation versus the increase in air temperature, and chose 4 models that were at the corners or the farthest spread of those different conditions. And those were deemed the variables that were most important to consider when looking at projections for future conditions on the Chesapeake Bay at the end of the century. So that gives you a sense of the variable space or the range of possible futures, but it doesn't necessarily dig into the probability or the full uncertainty space. And if you're looking at like the Froelich et al. Papers where they broke it down by ecosystem, that density of where is uncertainty, the dominant uncertainty by variable can actually change by location. So these are all considerations for how we are trying to compose these large ensembles. And the internal variability being a more important consideration on these shorter time horizons. So that was what Matt was talking about as an initial condition problem in that case. And you want to be testing, you want to know what that initial condition is and the probability around different possible starting points. So the complexity or the complication is that these models are really, they cost a lot. And to try to do all of your ensemble with these dynamically downscaled systems, if you're adding on top of that a biogeochemical model, wave model, or an ice model, if it's a very large system, it really isn't practical. So, and that may change depending on the time horizon. But at least in terms of the climate change models, the simulation lengths that you need to be generating, it's really not feasible necessarily to be doing, 50 ensemble members. Maybe it is if you're talking about 1 or 2 day forecasts, but that's another one of those trade-offs. You're talking about your simulation duration versus the complexity and how much of that uncertainty space you're exploring. So I'm going to end by highlighting 2 examples that we highlighted in our synthesis paper, one of them by Barb Mulling, where Barb used a statistical downscaling approach. It's actually a machine learning algorithm to use these model trees in terms of essentially downscaling paired with a hydrological model to look at the comparison of surface temperature and surface salinity in the Chesapeake Bay and just how well they could represent and reproduce conditions historically. And it was a much less expensive approach than the dynamical downscaling simulations. And then the last one, I think Al Hermann will be on later today to talk about some of this work, but a hybrid dynamical statistical approach for looking at the Bering Sea, specifically looking at the bottom temperature in the Bering Sea. So what they did was did a small subset of dynamically downscaled simulations and then using EOFs to identify the dominant modes of atmospheric conditions, or rather the dominant modes of ocean change based on atmospheric conditions, then projecting the GCMs back onto those modes, we're able to fill out that probability space and massively increase that ensemble size. So it's a much less expensive approach where you're still utilizing dynamical methods, but filling it in with statistical, additional approaches. So that's kind of where I want to end, was just that I don't want to undersell dynamical downscaling. It's a very powerful tool, and there's a lot we can do with it. But really, if we want to be using forecasts or having forecasts with these very large ensembles, then we probably need to be thinking about additional resources to bring in to support these efforts. And some of that might be in the statistical downscaling realm or machine learning as well. And that's what I got.
Our next speaker is Colleen Petrik from Schools.
Hold all your questions because we're gonna. hold all your questions because we're gonna have questions for all speakers during the discussion section, which you just asked for. So.
So I'll be talking about the capabilities and challenges for empirical and mechanistic modeling of marine ecosystems and fisheries. And I'd like to really thank the virtual fisheries group for perfectly setting up my talk today. So I'm going to couch this talk in major accomplishments, potential accomplishments, and potential challenges. So let's start with one of the major accomplishments that we've already heard a lot about today, and that's ocean predictions, these different ensembles of prediction experiments from Ncar and from GFDL that are creating these reforecasts that we can determine if there is predictive skill of variables in the ocean. And we've seen that there is this potential predictability of variables like sea surface temperature, net primary production, and pH, which are all quantities that are relevant for fisheries and ecosystems. So these mechanistic ocean predictions have been used in the terms of fisheries. So this is another major accomplishment that we heard about yesterday from Desiree Tomasi, and this was about using these mechanistic ocean predictions in an empirical model of fish biomass to set harvest guidelines. And by using either past environmental information or past and future predictions of the environment, coupled with the relationship between sea surface temperature and sardine biomass, you could create harvest guidelines that did better than the current system, both by increasing the yield of the sardine and by reducing the variability of the stock biomass. So this is a specific species and stock, but most of my talk is going to be focused on bigger pictures, as in all the fish in the sea, or grouping them into functional types, or thinking about their ecosystems as a whole. So another major accomplishment is this paper by Park et al. That was using the GFDL prediction experiments to examine the predictive skill of total fish catch across large marine ecosystems. And they wanted to meet a couple of quantities. First, you had to have predictive skill of sea surface temperature or chlorophyll in a large marine ecosystem. Once that condition was met, there had to be a significant relationship between sea surface temperature and chlorophyll with fish catch over time in that large marine ecosystem. And then for the places where those two conditions were met, here you can see the correlation of an empirical estimate of fish catch with observations. So there are several large marine ecosystems that meet these conditions and have predictive skill as indicated by the red shading. So this is wonderful. This is a potential way to use our mechanistic ocean predictions to predict fish catch. But what about all the large marine ecosystems that don't show up here? One, it could be that our ocean predictions are not skillful there, or it could be that relationship with fish catch. And we know that there are many other drivers of fish catch beyond sea surface temperature and net primary production or chlorophyll. For a while now, we've known that net primary production is a poor predictor of fish catch. And multiple studies, empirical studies by Friedland et al. And Stock et al. Have shown that metrics that are more related to secondary production and export production are better predictors of total fish catch. Whereas these metrics of zooplankton production and export production can also tell you about the composition of the catch. Van Dendert et al. Showed that it determines whether you're going to have a system dominated by large pelagic fish or by demersal fish. So we need to consider other drivers beyond sea surface temperature and net primary production, such as secondary production and export production, when we're examining the skill of our ocean predictions. And there are plenty of other quantities we could think about: bottom temperature, pH, oxygen, and the combined effect of oxygen and temperature, which is termed the metabolic index. So we've seen a bit about this today from Matt and from Zhoumin Chen's poster that she summarized yesterday. And so this is thinking about kind of the mechanistic effects of oxygen and temperature on animal physiology. This metabolic index tells you about the oxygen supply versus the oxygen demand of an organism, where the supply is influenced by the oxygen available in the environment and the demand is influenced by temperature. And it creates a space in this oxygen versus temperature state space that is habitable for an organism versus uninhabitable. There's a critical threshold there. So this is a theoretical understanding, but we can then apply it to observations of these species-specific parameters of oxygen supply and demand. And if we use anchovy-specific parameters, we define that critical threshold, that's that black line, and then can compare it to observations of presence or absence of anchovies. And what we see is that anchovies are pretty much only present above that critical threshold. So it's doing a good job of predicting the habitable oxygen temperature space of that organism. And not only does it predict presence or absence, but if we look at the metabolic index over time, it shows a strong correlation with larval abundance of anchovy. So this also has some predictive potential, or is a framework that we should be thinking about for making predictions about fisheries and ecosystems. And of course, I'm just going to make this statement that we've heard a lot already, that empirical fish relationships assume a static relationship that was estimated under historic conditions, and that climate change might force us to extrapolate beyond those conditions. And so we need to continuously reevaluate those relationships with new observations. Or we could not use empirical relationships, and we could use a mechanistic fish model. So this is one example of such a model. This is FISTI, the Fisheries Size and Type model. For those of you unfamiliar with it, it is built on first principles. It has 3 size classes of fish, small, medium, and large, that roughly equate to different life stages of 3 different functional types: forage fish or small pelagic fish, large pelagics, which are often the highly migratory species, and demersal fish that are living near the seafloor. So one accomplishment of this mechanistic model, when forced by mechanistic ocean climatology, is that it is able to reproduce observed patterns in nature. So this is one example. It is reproducing that pattern of using the ratio of zooplankton production to export production to tell you the composition of fish catch. When you have more zooplankton production, your large pelagics dominate. When there's more export production or benthic invertebrates, you have more demersals. And so under climatological conditions, the bottom-up forcing is able to simulate these broad-scale differences in fish ecosystems. It is able to create these oligotrophic gyres, continental shelf systems, and upwelling systems that all have different trophic structure. Given this skill, Matt Long and Sam Sedlecki and I proposed a framework for using mechanistic ocean models and mechanistic fish models to examine the climate impacts on the predictability of fisheries. So this is a multi-step framework we designed here. First, we need to examine more of our prediction variables beyond temperature and sea surface, or beyond temperature and NPP. So we'll be looking at things like secondary production, export production, and the metabolic index, and examining the skill of those predictions. When there are skillful predictions of those variables of interest to living marine resources, we then need to identify which of those physical and biogeochemical drivers are the dominant ones influencing fish variations. So I showed you a climatology that this model is good at capturing that mean state, but but we also want to be able to capture the variability in fish over time. Once we have, skillful environmental variables and a clear relationship of those drivers influencing fish variability, we'll make fish predictions and assess the skill of those fish predictions. And finally, we hope to bring this full circle and put the fish into a fully coupled two-way online framework where they're within the Earth system model and can feed back on the plankton and biogeochemistry. So let's look at this second step. Are the physics and biogeochemistry from the mechanistic ocean models able to explain fish variation? So to do this, I'm using our best representation of the past environment. That's a forced ocean sea ice simulation, and examining if the interannual variability in fish biomass has any relationship to large-scale climate indices. And shown here is the correlation of fish biomass with the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And sure enough, there are some large correlations with large-scale climate. So that's good. We know that the fish do have variability, and it does seem to be related to climate forcing. Some other patterns emerge here. We can see when examining the correlation of fish in the California current ecosystem with the Pacific Decadal Oscillation at different annual time lags, that there is a pattern based on the size of the fish. And as size increases, you get a longer lag between when the climate changed and when those impacts are felt in the fish or experienced in the fish population. And this is something that we see in observations quite frequently. The older a fish is, the longer lived it is, the longer it takes to see the impacts of climate variability, because it is, averaging over the conditions of that it's experienced in its life. Yet another similar pattern is the way that the variability itself is different in these size classes. Smaller size classes have very high frequency variability, which gets smoothed out as you look at larger size classes. And this is not unlike the double integration hypothesis of DiLorenzo and Oman. So we've got a climate signal that is being propagated to the fish biomass. That's great. Now can we identify what physical or biogeochemical drivers are passing that signal? So there are basically two types of drivers or forcing for feisty, and that's temperature of the environment, whether the pelagic realm or seafloor, and then there's prey, either zooplankton or the flux of detritus to the bottom that becomes benthic invertebrates. So I tried to tease these two apart by doing somewhat of a Reynolds decomposition of this forced ocean sea ice simulation. So the black line shows you that full forcing, whereas the gray line is the climatology of the forcing. And then in red, we have variable temperature and a climatology of prey, whereas blue is a climatology of temperature and variable prey. And so you'll notice this is the example of total fish biomass across the entire globe. We can look at this at the large marine ecosystem level. Here is the California current ecosystem, looking at different size classes of fish, as well as different functional types. And that blue line, where you're just changing the prey and not the temperature, basically overlaps with the full model, the black line. So this suggests that varying the prey alone can capture the full dynamics of the system. However, I must note that the prey were influenced by temperature in the ESM. So this is more like separating the effect of temperature on physiology versus the prey availability. If we just focus on all the fish total and look across the US large marine ecosystems, It's not always the case that prey captures the whole signal. Temperature does have a larger effect in particularly cold or warm large marine ecosystems. You can see this at the bottom, in the middle with the northeast US shelf, or middle left in Hawaii. So this analysis suggests what we've kind of already seen in the climatology, that prey are the really important component for predicting fish variability. So we need to assess our predictive skill of zooplankton. I don't have these results yet to show you, but I can show you what are the historical skill estimates of biogeochemical variables that we've done in climate model intercomparison projects. So these are some correlations of different biogeochemical variables in CMIP5 and CMIP6 Earth system models, and their correlation with observations. You'll see that variables like oxygen, nitrate, and silica have very high correlations, whereas chlorophyll much, much lower. And so this is a potential challenge, is that we have pretty poor skill of plankton. So here on the left, NPP, in the middle, export production, which results from our plankton processes, and all the way on the right, mesozooplankton biomass. And zooplankton was something brought up by the fisheries group this morning. We are really lacking observations globally over time. So those chlorophyll, NPP, and export production skill assessments were able to use a time series of observations. However, those time series are not available globally for zooplankton. There's one product, and it is a climatology of all the observations collected before 2015. You can see them here, and even when we include all those observations, there are still large regions of data scarcity. We can get around some of this issue by creating a global product with statistical methods. So we've got now full coverage of the globe, but still we can really only get a seasonal cycle. And we can use this for doing skill assessments and assessing spatial patterns and trends. However, these time series are going to be important for calculating predictive skill of our ocean prediction experiments. And it's really important for us to understand how well our models are performing, because they can show such variability in the long-term projections. This variability very likely comes from structural and parameter differences in our biogeochemical models. This is just one illustration showing all the different prey sources across different Earth system models. There could be basically every type of phytoplankton, zooplankton, and detritus available to mesozooplankton, or relatively few. And if you really want to understand the full differences in structural and parameters across these biogeochemical models, see the Carney et al. Paper in Frontiers in Marine Science. So it's possible that having more observations, particularly of zooplankton rates, could help us constrain our models and lend some mechanistic insights. And these problems we have with assessing the skill of our zooplankton predictions are the same as assessing the skill of our fish predictions. What do we compare them against? We're lacking observations globally over time of fisheries independent estimates of biomass. We've got plenty of global fisheries dependent estimates of catch and effort, but when it comes to fisheries independent fish biomass, it's really scattered throughout institutions, and they haven't been processed in a way that facilitates comparing times and places. So here are some perspectives for our discussion session. One thing that I might hypothesize is that it'd be more important to use ensembles that span the structural and parameter uncertainty of plankton and fish, rather than ensembles of one model that just has initial condition perturbations. And then another really big issue that I haven't touched on at all is these top-down effects. How important is it for us to predict fishing mortality to be able to make ecosystem predictions? Thank you.
We are moving now to our last speaker, Ethan Deyle from Boston University.
Yep. Just the over arrow. Hi, good morning. We're back on track thanks to the other presenters. Hopefully I can keep us there. I am not only talking about machine learning approaches in ecological forecasting. I'm Ethan Deyle. I'm a research assistant professor at BU. I'm affiliated with the marine program. I'm in the Department of Biology. A lot of the work that I'm actually going to talk about today, I did while I was at Scripps. I was there as a graduate student and then a postdoc. And this is mostly postdoc work funded by NSF and then DoD's CERTA program. They were briefly interested in basic science, at least. It'll come around again, I'm sure. I really enjoyed the talks and the discussion sections and the summaries for the ones that I missed. It's been a lot of food for thought for me, so hopefully I can put that aside and give you a coherent talk. And in doing, give you all some more food for thought. I am going to briefly talk about myths and merits of machine learning in our particular context. That'll lead into a little bit of definition and history, at least from my limited perspective. And then I have two different applications to talk about, red tide forecasting and hypoxia. Hopefully connect to some of the other things people have talked about there. And then if I have time, closing thoughts. So myths and about machine learning, also known as my strawman slide. Right, you might have an idea that machine learning is new and untested in ecological forecasting. I would say that's not true. It actually has a 30-year track record at making ecological forecasts. There's a perception of machine learning as a black box. That certainly can be true. It can be used in that way, but depending on what you're doing and how you're doing it, machine learning can actually yield actionable and predictive insight into mechanism. I think that feeds a little bit into things that have come up recently in terms of extending empirical relationships to non-stationary futures. So I'll try to tuck that in. Also, there's a perception that machine learning approaches are complicated. That can also very much certainly be true, but you can also, they can be minimally assumptive. And in the case of what I do, they are surprisingly unsophisticated. Right, so this first little myth and reality, I'm contending that there's a 30-year track record of machine learning in ecological forecasting, in marine ecological forecasting. The truth of that depends a little bit on what you mean by machine learning. This is what one data science consulting company thinks of as machine learning. It's a very big topic. It involves a lot of different categories, a lot of different methods. One of the big distinctions, some of you may already have a better idea than I do. I guess I don't have access, but you see there at the bottom on the right, supervised machine learning is where humans have gone in and annotated the data in some way, in particular labeled inputs and outputs. So whatever algorithm you have, you're telling it what you want it to output. That makes it a supervised machine learning approach. Unsupervised eliminates that human intervention. So we've actually, I've already messed up the computer. So we've seen some unsupervised machine learning approaches in the course of doing ecological forecasting. Right, yesterday, self-organizing maps, a kind of artificial neural network, were mentioned. They were done for feature selection and clustering and understanding currents. We also, Clarissa mentioned Cytobot, which uses machine learning to classify images in the course of collecting data. There's a lot of that in the plankton, in coral reefs, right? Photomosaic data, I do a little bit of that. What I'm going to talk about is using machine learning to actually do the forecast. So this is very much supervised learning because you're telling it what you want it to predict. You're not telling it how to predict necessarily. You're letting an algorithm determine how to predict the thing, but you're telling it what you want to predict. If you go back to 1990 and 1994, the work of my PhD advisor, disclaimer, George Sugihara and his PhD advisor, Robert May, this is really, in modern language, we would call this a machine learning forecast. And they were predicting a few different things. There was an epidemiological application, but it included the diatom counts that W.E. Allen had made in the early part of the 1900s. And the method they were using was very simple. It was based on nearest neighbor forecasting, but there was a little bit of math tied in there. The basic question they were trying to answer was really, are these ecological time series predictable at all? Because there was an idea that at least some of the time you were making measurements, you were just looking at noise around some kind of equilibrium system. And if all you're looking at is noise, then those fluctuations shouldn't be predictable. But the question of predictability in a parametric framework is tied into the question of whether you have the right model. And the machine learning approach lets you say, okay, I'm going to be totally agnostic about the model. Is it predictable at all? And I guess I'm just going to have to use the mouse click. So if you first difference the diatom counts, you can get something that looks a lot like noise. But in fact, it's something that with simple machine learning algorithms, you can predict out a week or 2 weeks with much greater skill than persistence. Right, the 1990 paper was based on this nearest neighbor forecasting, just trying to find historical states that were analogous and make a prediction based on that. The 1994 paper progressed on that using this idea of locally weighted regression, right? So you remember in calculus, if you have a nonlinear curve and you zoom in close enough, it starts to look like a line. And for a dynamical system, even if it's highly nonlinear in the state space, if you zoom in close enough, you can approximate it with a linear vector equation. And so if you have your data in the state space, you can use a local weighting in the state space, and you can basically approximate the Jacobian of the system and thereby approximate the dynamics. The way that George formulated this was with a single tuning parameter, right? So unlike some of the advanced neural network approaches now, this approach has one and a half parameters, the number, the dimension of your state space, and then this theta parameter. And the theta parameter tunes the weighting, and as a consequence, when theta is 0, you just have vector autoregression or multivariate autoregression, depending on whether you're in econometrics or you're in ecology. And you can see with the diatom predictions that a vector autoregressive model does beat just the autoregression. There is... I'm so sorry. There is some predictability there beyond just autoregression, but as you tune that, you get much more predictability. So that was related to their fundamental questions at the time. To sort of get this all in a little bit of a more comfortable framework, a lot of what we're doing here when we're using supervised machine learning for forecasting is using an algorithm as a universal function approximator. So you can take the same framework that Mike Dietz lays out in his textbook and work for ecological forecasting, where the future state is a function of the current state and drivers, plus uncertainty in the parameters and noise. And instead of that function being something that you've hypothesized or derived from first principles, it's an algorithm. And so this can encapsulate a lot of different things, the nearest neighbor forecasting I talked about, generalizations of regression, including the local linear regression. Artificial neural networks can be used for a lot of different things, but they can be used for this. Some of the other applications we talked about that have come up are more or less using them as function approximators. Gaussian processes for the Bayesian version, talked to Steve Munch at Santa Cruz, random forest also. These tools bear a lot of similarity to surface interpolation or surface learning, right? So if you're thinking of the chlorophyll that you're measuring as just responding to physical drivers, then you really could just do surface interpolation. But actually I believe in intrinsic ecological dynamics. I think everybody else does. So a lot of the time what we're doing is trying to predict dynamics, not just a response surface. So it looks a little different, very similar, but there's actually more power in there. And I'm going to gloss over this, but if you've ever heard of Taken's theorem, this is where the differential topology in that theory comes in. Because when you're observing change over time in a system that's dynamic, you actually have a lot more information. And so that gives one of the strongest strengths originally for this kind of work, which is that it can be robust to unobserved variables. That's why Sugihara and May were able to look at a single time series and make a prediction of that as a multivariate system. And it was using this relationship between change over time and the additional variables of dimensionality. That's something you can do with all those different universal function approximators. So in many ways, they're all flexible approaches that can accomplish the same thing. Really big strength of theirs is they let you sidestep structural uncertainty. This is played out in some publications recently regarding stock recruitment relationships. I want to talk about red tide forecasting really quickly and then talk about hypoxia. So I'm picking up this story. The short-term forecasting work was published in 2017. We were working with John McGowan at Scripps. It's in an ecology paper. And other folks introduced the system, luckily. We were using machine learning due to uncertainty in the drivers and mechanisms, and in fact, a lack of linear statistical evidence for that supported those hypotheses about drivers. So there was a question of whether it was predictable at all, which is a good question for machine learning, right? We don't have to worry about whether we have the right equations. We had some pretty good results. We did a lot of in-sample analysis, but we held out, at the time, the most recent history out of sample to see if at the end of the day, when we did all these things, there's a lot of potential for overfitting in all modeling, machine learning, more than anything else. So we held out data to see if we could actually predict blooms at the end of the day once we had made all of our choices. And the out-of-sample forecast skill was substantially lower than the in-sample forecast skill. That was not surprising, but it was also still very statistically meaningful, which was really, all we could hope for. The next part of the work has not been published because it was not terribly successful, but that was the Department of Defense was briefly interested in the question of whether red tides were going to get more common in Southern California. So we wanted to see if we could use iterative forecasting with the machine learning. Iterative forecasting with a short-term forecaster introduces some problems. One of them is that model bias becomes really important. So you can see this even with a very simple model of disease outbreaks. This is one of the most simple ecological models, the SIR model. As you start to iterate a skillful short-term predictor, your statistics, this is highly chaotic, so your ability to predict specific events goes down, but you're still hoping that you can predict the statistics correctly. And the simple methods we use tend to be median biasing, and as a consequence, you stop being able to simulate the frequency of large events when you're iterating a lot. We understood the source of this bias ahead of time. We knew this going in, so we had a plan, and basically if you introduce stochasticity based on the uncertainty, then you can much more reliably recover the statistics of large events over long periods of time. On the flip side, I don't have time to run through this, but check out the story of Facebook's profit algorithm causing Zillow to have to fire a lot of people. They had a very sophisticated artificial neural network and weren't careful about model bias, and the model was biasing them to value everything as something that they should purchase for profit. And here's the late, great Bob Ross in a meme showing you a picture of all the homes that Zillow accurately evaluated. So this is my dogma, and it's dogma, that simple approaches are often best here because you can understand what's going on, in particular with bias, and you can correct it quickly. What we were trying to do is feed the short-term forecasting with climate scenarios. We had two different frameworks for doing this, and the second one ended up being all we could do, which was to generate simple hypothetical statistical futures based on shifting the mean and resampling variability into that model and doing a climate sensitivity analysis. The reason why the grand approach didn't work is that the ROMS model we were able to get, I had to fly out to Rutgers and knock on some doors, but they were happy to oblige. Right, the Scripps peer is not represented well even by a small-scale ROMS model. It's simulating a different system in a lot of ways. Our best answer was to assume that the direction of change was the same and then feed that into our climate sensitivity analysis. And if you do that, the systematic changes that we have confidence in both point towards increasing frequency of red tides in 2050. I think it's not terribly surprising, but I have a few minutes to run through hypoxia. What I didn't tell you is that it's limnology, not oceanography, but I did get that signed off on. This is work done with some Swiss scientists, Swiss and French scientists, Damien Bouffard, principally. The problem in Lake Geneva is very similar to what was laid out for the Chesapeake. The question's almost exactly the same. Are the changes in nutrients through management really going to continue to work under climate change? Because we have basic first principles understandings that hypoxia is going to get worse in Lake Geneva as the atmosphere warms. The challenge is that the lake has undergone a huge change in phosphorus loading, and that's precipitated large changes in the food web. So including an increase in filamentous diatoms and really different amounts of export flux, which really change the biological side of oxygen consumption and depth. So when our collaborators came to us, what they had was a 1D physical model that really predicts the thermal structure of the lake very well. Right, this is a lot easier than Chesapeake Bay. You just need to consider river input and wind and temperature. But feeding it into a simple, dozens of parameters kind of biogeochemical model did not produce very good forecasts. And again, that's because there's been large changes in the lake, right? So when we write a parameterized model, we have fixed coefficients for things that are really not basic rules of the universe. They're emergent properties of the phytoplankton community and things like this. The phytoplankton community changes, these things change too. And they thought about trying to write more parameters to try to simulate those dynamics as well, and they then sent us some emails and thought about a different way to proceed. And so that's basically what this project was seeing if just with the top-level biogeochemical variables like chlorophyll and the oxygen, as well as the physical drivers, can we represent the necessary rates of oxygen control to make better forecasts without 100 parameters that we can't really hope to reliably fit. And one of the benefits of the really simple approach, right, is, I mentioned this before, if you use weighted regression, what you're really doing is approximating the Jacobians of the system. And the Jacobians of the system actually contains information about the coupling. So while we're learning about this from data, we actually have information about rates and relationships that is actionable. And in fact, when we do the data science project, we recover things like, right, if you see an A, when the system was extremely eutrophic over on the right side at really high total phosphorus, changes in phosphorus didn't really precipitate changes in chlorophyll because there was no nutrient limitation. We usually think of phosphorus as limiting in limnological systems, but there was way, way, way too much phosphorus. And so this is some of the nonlinearity that you can see in the big picture that can help you guide management and that you can pull out of the data science and get the mechanism represented without 100 parameters. 10 seconds. So this is what we did. We took their model structure. The SimStrat is the physical model, and they had a 2-box model of the lake, epilimnion and a hypolimnion, and we basically replaced the biogeochemical parameters parts with an empirical model that we developed. And so what we ended up doing was generating a fully coupled hybrid model where we weren't just forcing with parametric physics, but the oxygen information is exchanging between these. So that was a huge headache, but it turned out we got much higher predictability and we were able to make some long-term forecasts that you will be able to read about very soon, I'm excited to say. I will say my closing thoughts for our workshop discussion section. Thank you.
So let's just thank the speakers this morning again. I think we saw quite a grand tour of advances in methodology. We, of course, led off our discussion this morning with a discussion of some of the big challenges. So maybe over the break, please be thinking about how some of the things that were discussed today can map onto some of those challenges that were presented in our first session this morning. And then hopefully we'll have a nice fruitful discussion section with any kind of questions you might have on what was presented. But for now, let's have a break and refuel, and we'll see you back in. We've got a number of excellent lightning talks today. We're going to start with 2 remote speakers. The first is Hermann. Al, are you with us?
I believe I am. Am I sufficiently connected?
Great, I'll take it away.
Okay. I'm just going to briefly describe some work we've been doing within the ACLIME project. That's Alaska Climate Integrated Modeling. And that involves a large cast of players. In particular, I want to mention Wei Cheng, who's attending virtually this conference, also Kirsten Holzman and Anne Hollowed, and a large number of other people. And basically, we are engaged in dynamical downscaling of several Earth system models to the Bering Sea, and that's the element you see in the center there, ROMS NPZ. From that, we generate relevant features for fisheries, in particular the Bering Sea cold pool, bottom temperature generally across the Bering Sea shelf, and zooplankton, which serve as prey to many fish, as you've been hearing today. The output from those dynamically downscaled projections of the Bering Sea through the 21st century get fed into fish models developed by people at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and eventually fed into socioeconomic models. And this is all part of a management strategy evaluation to see if they can come up with more future-proof ways of managing fish in the Bering Sea. Next slide. So we have both for CMIP 5 and for CMIP 6, we have been experimenting with using some multivariate EOF methods to summarize the results of the dynamical downscaling. And here, the center figure you see sort of illustrates the strength of association in the regional model output across multiple variables shown vertically and months of the year shown horizontally. And if you look at one of the yellow boxes there, you'll see T air underscore FRC down towards the bottom. That's air temperature. And look a little further up, you'll see one temp bottom 5M. That's the bottom temperature averaged over the bottom 5 meters of the water column. Further up, highlighted in green, you'll see EUPS, that's eufausids, depth integrated, and the red indicates that certain elements are going up together, up and down together, and blue indicates an inverse correlation. And to the left, you will see spatial patterns that correspond to these associations. So it's kind of like we're doing EOFs on individual variables and then seeing how those those different EOFs tend to go up and down together. There are some subtle variations on that. If you want the details, I invite you to read the paper shown in the lower right-hand corner there, published in DSR. And that will lead you back to the previous one also that we did with CMIP 5. Now, the virtue of this approach is it allows you to project output from a much larger ensemble of global models onto these multivariate modes and infer what you would have obtained if you had the computational resources to dynamically downscale those global models to the Bering Sea. So in the upper right-hand corner, what we have is a plot of estimated temperature increase between now and the end of the 21st century in bottom temperature. And so what you're seeing is a dire prediction of under SSP 585, which is the business as usual, burn away, burn lots of coal and oil scenario. Bottom temperatures there, we're estimating, are going to increase on the order of 4 degrees centigrade. The plot just below it shows the big spaghetti diagram there is a whole lot of individual realizations obtained through this statistical method, and the thicker red line shows the ensemble mean, and that's for bottom temperature averaged over the Bering Sea shelf. All right, next slide.
Al, if you could give us
Thanks.
some quick versions, that'd be great.
I'm sorry, what?
I was just going to say we're a little short on time, so if you give us the
Oh,
abbreviated.
okay. Okay, yeah, just very quickly. This is an attempt at a machine learning approach, and here we're trying to relate the first mode EOFs of various forcing variables to the first mode EOF of bottom temperature in the Bering Sea. And we applied both very traditional linear model, multivariate regression, and long short-term memory method, machine learning. And we found that the machine learning performed better, up to 50% better. And so we think there's promise in using machine learning as an alternate way of doing this sort of replication of the behavior of the dynamically downscaling approach. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Al. All right, our next speaker is also coming to us remotely, beaming in, Lisa Wagner from the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Sciences. Lisa, are you with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Well, I'm glad to be here to do my part to overload you with information. So let's dive in. I want to acknowledge that this is a big team effort. Jeremy Testa is the lead. He couldn't be with you today, but my colleague Matt Weber, my fellow economist, is here. And what this team took on was the challenge of trying to connect climate change forecasts to economic change. And of course, that requires filling in a lot of intermediate steps of what are the sensitivities in the system, how do biological organisms respond, and how do people respond? So we have a behavioral component as well. The Chesapeake Bay is our test case. Oyster aquaculture is our focus. And of course, we're living in that rich modeling and data environment, which enables us to make progress on understanding what the future variability might be. But as I always learn as an economist on these coupled human natural system models, is you never have the exact data you would like to have. But I'm highlighting some of the key things that we used right here, and I'll get into more details in the next slide. So next slide, please. So we used three main types of models. So as may be apparent now, this is a mechanistic kind of model coupling exercise. And so, to understand the climate change impacts on water quality, we have the hydrodynamic biogeochemical models, the ROMS RCA-CC implementation. That's providing a lot of data. I'm going to skip over that column, that second column for a second, and go right to the biological model. So those water quality and spatial and temporal details are feeding a biological model. We found an existing model, ShellSim, projecting a lot of oyster growth and oyster dynamics, but it had to be modified substantially. And one of the key things it was missing was a real mortality response to changing environmental conditions. So that's that second column there, where we really had to do some other types of analyses to give us the relationships we needed to understand how climate change was going to affect oysters most likely, and where the sensitivities were. And then all of that feeds the economic model. And this is, in some sense, a behavioral model, although the aquaculturists that we're modeling is really smart. And what this is saying is that an aquaculturist could observe the current conditions to understand expected growth and expected survival, and can make a decision about whether to plant, whether to try to mitigate for climate change impacts. And what this yellow-blue diagram is showing is the interface between the yellow and the blue is the threshold of profitability. So if you're in the yellow, you're expected to make a profit. If you're in the purple, blue, you probably wouldn't make a profit under these environmental conditions. And so this helps us understand this helps us understand the economics of it all, and also how a grower might respond to changing conditions. So some of the key things we've been finding, as you might see in this middle, in the biological model, so those families of curves are showing different weather scenarios that we're using. And so you see, obviously, the growth of an oyster does respond to climate variability. But if you compare the two, the upper and the lower graph, you can see that the site variability is larger than the interannual weather variability. So, that is, there's a lot of model coupling that goes on, and then let's jump to the results. Next slide, please. So we haven't fully explored all the spatial heterogeneity of our results, but so far what we're seeing is that oyster growth is generally increasing in response to the climate change, but that can be offset by mortality increases. And then those mortality increases seem largely driven, these are mid-century projections, largely driven by low salinity events rather than acidification-induced mortality. But we haven't, as I said, we haven't looked everywhere in the spatial realm yet, so we may find some that varies by site. And then there's high spatial heterogeneity, more than temporal variability. But what's important is the predictability of the system. So one of the key factors that generates predictability for the grower is temporal autocorrelation of conditions. And what we're able to do with this model is actually show the value of improved forecasting skill. Because what this graphic on the bottom is showing is that as we increase our ability to project future conditions as a function of past conditions, the grower can use that information to maximize his profits. And so we see profits going up. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Next up, Jessica Garwood will be joining us in person. take it away. Just...
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Okay. I'll let Val get it.
Perfect. So I'm fairly new to this community, so I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm Jessica Garwood, and typically I study the dynamics of physical biological interactions at subgrid scales, often in waters less than 50 meters, but not today. And so this talk will be as satisfying as the end of the Blair Witch Project, because I will let you know what might come, but not what has happened. So to motivate this work, and since I had the mic, I also decided to highlight the work of Victoria Boatwright, who gave an excellent OSM presentation on some of the things that I will discuss in a regional model. So if you still have access to those presentations, I would check it out. So observations in the open ocean have seen hotspots of carbon export due to eddy-driven subduction. And when people have tried to look at that on larger domains, they've found conflicting or nuanced results where at larger scales, the downward and upward transport of carbon by these features may cancel out. However, if you consider particles sinking in those dynamics, then maybe there is enhanced carbon export. And what I'm focusing on is the fact that eddies and some mesoscales stir plankton, right, which can then reverberate through the food web due to the different dynamics and how prey and predators may or may not overlap, especially if you consider vertical migration. So the method we're using, we have a double gyre simulation, which is in an idealized setting, and that's something that many other authors have done, which I've listed here. They're a bit of our inspiration. And we use cobalt, which Charlie may tell you more about it, but here there's very complex food web dynamics, so that we can have this non-linearities in the ecosystem and not just in the physical processes. To initialize the ocean state, which you see here in purple on the left, I use uniform profiles of temperature and salinity. I also have, so the profiles are not uniform in depth, right? We have a structure in depth, but they're applied uniformly throughout the domain. My ocean is flat, 4,000 meter depth. And I do the same with all of the biogeochemical component of the model. And so the purple band is the part of the ocean over which I get those average profile. So they are definitely North Atlantic inspired. Then in terms of the forcing, I get a zonal mean, a monthly zonal mean for most of the forcing. And again, I apply it uniformly at every point of longitude, I apply the same forcing, except for the shortwave radiation, because our biogeochemistry needs a daily cycle in light. And now what happens? I don't have results, but these figures are so fresh off the server that if some of my collaborators are in the online audience, this will be the first time we can talk about them. And so what I have a 1 degree resolution, which you see on top, just to kind of spin up for 1,000 years to get my ocean to equilibrate. And so you can see barotropic transport, which shows you this double gyre idealized setting. Then we use that to initialize a 1/9 of a degree resolution. And this is only 10 out of 100 years of eddying ocean, but we can already see with the vorticity that we have an ocean with more dynamics. And eventually we will get to that 1/27 of a degree resolution, but I need to first make sure that the 1/9 of a degree ocean makes sense. We've already spent some time making sure that the double gyre makes sense and we don't have surface salinity of 32. So there's probably some things we want to troubleshoot at lower resolution before we push that to the higher resolution domain. And so what you see then, the green plot is a quick Hofmüller diagram of surface chlorophyll. Quick check that cobalt is giving us something sensible. We have the months on the x-axis, the latitude on the y-axis. In black is the mixed layer depth at a fixed value. So we can see that as this value is shallowing, then we get the surface bloom in the spring. But again, we still need to bring that to a higher resolution and do some additional validation. Thank you.
Next is Hyungyu Lim from Princeton University.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Hyungyu Lim from Princeton University, and this work is collaboration work from GFDL main folks, and including Charles Stark. And my major is climate dynamics by training, but I'm trying to look at the ENSO effect itself in the Equatorial Pacific region. So, for example, when we have the observational ENSO evolutions in the mature ENSO state, they have a lot of decreasing nutrients, so they have less productivity in the tropical Pacific regions. But however, after evolving the ENSO from mature state to decay, they have interesting patterns to have the phytoplankton bloom. We try to call the chlorophyll rebound, as shown in the left figure. So we are wondering how we predictable or can we capture this chlorophyll pattern scale in the new generation model GFDL ESM 4.1. Then that's the results for the right figure. This is ENSO regression from mature ENSO state to the decay. As you can see, they have a very similar feature between them, so which means they have very nice scale for the ENSO chlorophyll coupling. So left bottom is the pattern correlation scale in the Equatorial Pacific regions. As you can see, the sky blue is the ESM 4.1 features. As you can see, the decaying ENSO chlorophyll rebound is well captured in the new generation model rather than the previous CA5 state model. So we try to figure out what's the mechanism for that. The first one, we can address the oceanic drivers, which is the dominant factor to deliver the ion. So top panel is the temperature anomaly regression from the NINO 3.4 index. So as you can see that in the mature ENSO state, they have a lot of warm water volume and propagations from ENSO onset to decay. And at the same time, we can see the cold temperature signal, and they have the propagation through the equatorial undercurrent regions. So if you look at the temperature, we can imagine how the ion can be delivered based on this temperature anomaly. So bottom panel is ion dissolved ion anomaly signal. So the previous generation have some mimic ion delivery in the ENSO decaying state. However, we can see the ESM 4.1 have well captured this propagation of the ion, which is well described in the Chavez et al. 1990. And the other mechanism is that the ESM 4.1 include some more ion cycling from the land vegetation and precipitation soil moisture, and this emission of the dust. So dust includes a lot of ion source from South America, so it can deliver the ion deposition in the model. So we try to investigate the sensitivity test based on the ESM 4.1 static simulation. So left panel is a sensitivity test results based on the difference between the ESM 4.1 full couple model and turn off the dust interactions. So as you can see, the red means the more ion depositions, and throughout the ENSO years, because they have a water circulation weakening, which means the more subsidence motion in the land area. So South America could be more drier than before. So high dust emission could be a source of the ion deposition in the Equatorial Pacific. So right top panel shows the ESM 4.1, ESM 4.1 static ion sensitivity. So as you can see, the ENSO onset have less ion suppression, which means more ion precipitation can include more ion, less ion anomaly for to be negative in the onset and mature state. Decaying enso have more ion because more source from the random and atmospheric positions. We cannot evaluate the observational ion depositions, but we can compare these two satellite aerogeographical depths. So they have a well matching for this. So I believe they have a lot of opportunity to look at the atmospheric and sea coupling system for the ENSO in this region, and in addition to the other regional aspects like US coast regions. So thanks so much.
Next up is Mayor Pozo.
Yep. Well, hi everyone. So today, what I'm going to present is the impact of a downscaling method for future projection on the California current system. I'm going to present just two simple experiments where we start from a air system model. In this case, it's the GFDL, and we are going to do two downscaling methods. One that we directly downscale or we directly force or regional model with the output of the GFDL, and a second experiment where we apply a time variant delta method. So here this is a schematic of the time variant delta method that I'm going to explain. So if we're starting from the bottom left panel, we have the air temperature, and this is one of the forcing variables of the regional model. So in yellow, we have just the variability of this variable that we already use the time variant delta method to produce it. And then in black, we only have the low frequency variability of the air temperature. So if we take a particular year and we plot the seasonal variability that will be like the right panel on the bottom, we can see that our final forcing is this yellow line in here. And this final forcing has three components. Two components that come from the reanalysis data, where we take the climatology and the daily variability of or historical period or present climate that go from 1980 to 2010. And then we take a third component that comes from the air system model, that is this time variant delta. And this delta is constructed by using the variable that we are interested in downscale. And then we subtracted the climatology of the present climate that comes from the air system model. So then we add our three components, the climate variability, the daily variability, that are the green lines from the reanalysis, and then we add the time variant delta, the purple line, and we get our final forcing, that is our yellow line. So this is just some preliminary result. Here I want to show what is the impact of the downscaling when we represent the California undercurrent and their water masses properties. So here we are just focused on the historical period, and on the left we have the control simulation that have been run with reanalysis and that really look really similar to the observation. And where you have plotted the color, I'm representing the along slope velocity, so it's just taking the velocity that goes along the coast in the California current system, and then in contour I'm representing the isopycnal. So we can see, if we focus on summer, that is the third panel, we can see that the development of the undercurrent, then we have fall, then also in spring we have some of the beginning of the development of the undercurrent. And also we can see how the isopycnal 26.5, that usually is the one defined, the core of the undercurrent, is more or less, around 200 meters. So if we apply our time variant delta method, we can reproduce exactly what we can see in the observation, that is also really similar to our control simulation. However, if we use the output directly from the GFDL model and we don't apply our method, this is what we get. We get in summer, we get a weakening of the undercurrent. Then by fall, we see that the undercurrent is more shallow. And by spring, we don't even have the development of the undercurrent. It's only happening a little bit in the southern part of the California current system. And also you can see how the isopycnal layer is really deep in comparison with the control run. So my take-home message is that the global model should be bias corrected and downscaled to remove the systematic error and improve the representation, to improve spatial resolution. And then bias correction methods are needed when the global model output cannot represent key physical processes, like for example in the California current system is the undercurrent. If you want to know more, please come to check my physical poster that is right there, and I'm happy to chat. Thank you.
Andrew Ross.
All right, good morning. So we're talking about probabilistic SST forecasts in Chesapeake Bay. Get right into the questions. We will look at whether extreme SSTs in the bay can be forecast on timescales of days to weeks in advance. Then we want to know whether extreme SST forecasts could potentially provide economic value if used to inform decisions to reduce the impacts of those events. And finally, do probabilistic forecasts support better decisions than deterministic forecasts? So for the methods, we're start with by generating an ensemble of retrospective SST forecasts for the bay from an ensemble of retrospective air temperature forecasts. We're using air temperature forecasts from the Jeffs model, from the Subx data set. So this provides 35-day forecasts that were initialized weekly from 1999 to 2016. Each forecast has 10 ensemble members. From that 10 ensemble members of air temperature forecasts, we use a really simple model to generate SST forecasts. So all these forecasts are for this Thomas Point station here in the bay. It has a long time series of air and water temperatures that we can use to calibrate this simple model. All right, so next we use our ensemble of SST forecasts to produce a probabilistic forecast. We use a method called non-homogeneous Gaussian regression. Essentially, it fits a normal distribution to your ensemble. It allows the variance of that distribution to be informed by both the ensemble spread as well as your historical forecast error. So that gives you kind of a normal distribution as your probability forecast. Finally, with that probabilistic forecast, we forecast the probability of an extreme heat event during the summer. Here we're defining that as any summer day where the water temperature exceeds 27.5 degrees Celsius. I'll mention that a little bit more later. All right, so next we want to evaluate these forecasts. We did this using this kind of really simple decision-making framework. We're evaluating the forecasts by using them to decide whether or not we're going to spend a certain amount C to protect against the economic impact, LP, of some sort of hypothetical extreme event. So it kind of breaks down into this 2x2 confusion matrix setup, where you either forecast the event to occur and you spend C to take protection, or you don't forecast the event and then you're vulnerable to some kind of large loss. The way to use this to evaluate the forecast is to use your forecast to make decisions, hypothetical decisions, add the costs and loss that you would have experienced over time, and compare those with the cost and loss you would have made with either perfect forecasts or using long-term climatology. That gives you a value skill score, and you can show that that depends only on your forecast observations and the ratio of the cost of protection to the preventable loss. So the left figure here, or the middle figure, I guess, shows that forecast evaluation for lead 5 forecasts of the probability of an extreme heat event. The x-axis is that cost to loss ratio, anywhere from 0 to 1. The y-axis is the skill score. So 0 is your forecasts are no better than climatology. 100 is you have perfect forecasts. So you can see that using a probabilistic forecast to make decisions gives you pretty substantial forecast skill and increased value over almost all values of the cost to loss ratio. Deterministic forecasts give you skill in some cases towards kind of the middle range of that ratio, but not towards details and less than the probabilistic forecasts. And finally, I've shown damp persistence as a reference forecast. So this is just using a first order autoregression reversion to the mean. So that actually provides you some value over climatology as well, but still not as much as our probabilistic forecasts. Finally, on the right, so the middle figure shows just lead 5. The right is all leads for our probabilistic forecasts. So you can see, depending on your cost to loss ratio, we have anywhere between 1 and 2 weeks of forecasted skill for extreme heat events in Chesapeake Bay. So here's our conclusions. We found that the SST forecasts could be valuable if we apply them to reduce the impacts of extreme events. The information about uncertainty in the form of the probabilistic forecasts enable better hypothetical decisions. This is important for ecological forecasting. This review paper that I cite here shows that less than half of ecological forecasts provide information about uncertainty. And we show that that can make you better, give you better decision-making ability if you include it. The post-processing method that we used substantially improved the probabilistic forecast skill and value. I didn't show it, but the raw ensemble members are very under-dispersive, and don't accurately represent the uncertainty. This is partially due to the simple SST model that we used. That itself doesn't represent the full range of uncertainty. On the right here is some potential ecological applications that kind of inspired this work. They're using SST thresholds or air temperature thresholds to make a decision, but they're doing it in either deterministic or just climatological sense. So these are things that could be improved with accurate probabilistic forecasts. So thank you.
Bring us home for the spotlight talk sessions is Giacomo Navarra from Georgia Tech.
So good morning, everyone. So my name is Gian Giacomo. I want to talk about my work about empirical dynamical model to forecast fisheries. So when it comes to forecast a marine ecosystem, there are some challenges that came up because there may be lack of data and missing degrees of freedom on something we don't know. So the main purpose here is to see how good are the empirical dynamical model or linear inverse model to actually do a forecast of particular fish indicator, which I put on the left side. We have the biomass anomalies from the RAN database, the landings, which are the fish registered in local ports from the large marine ecosystem database, and the catches, which instead are fish caught in open sea, independently of the way they have been taken from the FAO database. So about that indicator, I want to emphasize that these have been normalized with the standard deviation, so the color bars in STD units. And each of the time series is associated to one specific stock. So that stock ID written there, that is the number of species of the region considered, in our case, is the Kuroshu-Yashu region, the Northwest Pacific. So I briefly described how the linear inverse model works. So we wanted to actually go beyond the limitation of the EOF, where modes have to be orthogonal. And so we describe no linearities that are always present in a marine ecosystem as a linear part that is the operator L multiplied by state vector driven by a Gaussian white noise like atmospheric forcing. So in our case, we use in the state vector the SST and the SSH of all the North Pacific basin, and plus one of the three indicators, so we repeat for each of them. So once you discretize the linear inverse model equation, you obtain L, and then you can calculate the forecast of the state vector at a specific leading time using the exponent of tau, of L multiplied tau. So here we wanted to consider the difference in a difference map between your forecasting skill, which is just your correlation between the state vector and the forecasted state vector, both projected in a respective number of EOF. And the difference being with the persistence, that is the first row in the top for all the three indicators, we see that even though we have detrended the data, there is still a good amount of persistence of 4 years for all the three cases. But when we do the difference, that is the bottom row, between the limb forecasting skill and the persistence, the limb actually adds the skill, but that goes beyond the persistent one of 3-4 years, in particular for the landings and the catches. Okay, so now this is great, but where actually this skill come from? So to do this, we made a sensitivity analysis that is made in two parts. The first one, that is the top row for the three indicator for the biomass landings and catches, we actually insert a constraint in the limb. We impose that the interaction terms, the cross term outside the main diagonal between the SST and the SSH with the fish indicator are 0. So no interaction with the physics. And we see in this case, by inserting this constraint, most of the stocks don't go beyond the persistent one. Then we wanted to see another contribution, which is the bottom row, where we don't input any constraint in the limb, but we consider one stock at every iteration of the limb. So in the bottom row, what this means is that we have excluded the marine ecosystem as a whole. We consider only one stock, and there is a decrease in skill, but not at the same amount of the first case. So to conclude, actually, the limb add the skill to the persistence, and the main contribution to this skill are given by the North Pacific ST, SSH, and also the stock-stock interaction. So as a next step, we wanted to extend this forecast by using a deep learning model. I will consider different indicators for that. Thank you. I will happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Giangiacomo. Thanks everybody who contributed to the Spotlight talk today. Now I think we are moving straight into the discussion, questions and discussion section. And so maybe I'll just open the floor to questions related to the talks this morning, the report outs, and of course the Spotlight talks. Does anyone want to start us off? So I know we got, Matt, all right. Nice.
Okay, this is a question, but I guess maybe. Oh yeah. I'm Matt Newman. Okay, so this is more a question, but I guess it's for a discussion too. This was, I guess, the first talk on dynamical downscaling. I've always kind of wondered this in general, that if you took the dynamical downscaling results and you coarse-grained them back to the original forcing field kind of grids, do you reproduce the forcing field, or do you end up with a pattern that is different? The reason why I wonder is because then, if it's more of the latter, it might suggest you are not entirely downscaling, you're actually making it an adjustment as well, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I'm just kind of curious.
Maybe let's see.
Hi, this is Drenkard. So I think it depends on where you are and what you're downscaling. So the picture I showed of the Buil et al. Of the sea surface temperature in the inter-American seas, if you were to project that back, to reinterpolate that back to the original 1 degree model, I think you would still have an emerging signal that you missed because you don't have the dynamics at the scale to resolve that upwelling signal off of like the Cancun part of Mexico. But there are probably locations where even if you do downscale it and then you interpolate it back onto the original grid, you're essentially going to reproduce the exact same change signal. So I think that it kind of points to one of our suggestions of saying, do you need to downscale in order to look at this signal? Because in the event that you have the exact same information, whether or not you downscale the fields that you're working with should help guide which direction you take that experiment. So I think that's actually a really important question when you embark on these experiments, is like, do I need to do this at all? And what value am I actually gaining in doing these experiments?
Yeah, it's kind of related. I mean, I think it's just kind of a general question about some of this downscaling. You know, there's this issue about, do you want to be doing it as opposed to doing machine learning to fill in if you've got these ensembles? And is the downscaling designed just to kind of create small scale information that the large scale model missed, or are you really creating a correction to the model? Because the approaches are not necessarily the same, or at least the way I would think about it is different. You're actually trying, in some sense, you're trying to fix the climate model by doing the downscaling.
In some ways, I think that also speaks to Mary's talk, right?
Right.
You know, I think you know, when you think about the statistical downscaling techniques, all of them are downscaling and bias correction. Both are included in there, and I think that for a while when we did dynamical, we sort of skipped that second critical part, and I think, you know, Mary's talk spoke to it in the review article that Liz wrote about. Half the studies have started to do it and half still don't, and I tend to agree with Mary's conclusion that, you know, it's part of the added value. And look, these global models, when they're run for climate change context, they're going to have regional biases. They're going to drift, and that's not going to change. That's a fundamental aspect of the way we build them and the way we force them. When the only thing that's holding the model kind of in place is you have this kind of remote radiation from the sun and a few other basic aspects of the Earth system. The California current, which is ultimately a few grid cells on all these boxes, is always going to be a little bit different than it actually is. So I think we can look. I tend to look at that as part of the added value of this downscaling technique, is to sort of allow ourselves to correct for that and bring us a little bit closer to the true mean state of the system. But whether there's a completely satisfactory way to do it, maybe Mayor, are you happy with the? You're happy with it that it improved it, but.
Well, this is Mayor. I'm happy that it can get improved, but therefore it's also depending what is your application of the downscaling, because this is at the end it's really expensive to run. So if someone is just interested in sea surface temperature, I feel that the only added value is happening at the coast, because the global model they don't really resolve the coast. But with downscaling we can. But if it's like a biogeochemical variable, I think it's a lot of value. Because, for example, we use a biogeochemical model that is parameterized for the California border system, while their system model, they have their own global parameterization. So I think that we get a lot of more value in those variables.
So do you think you're missing, or maybe you're not, but you think you might be missing something by the fact that you're not really upscaling back in a way, not in the physical sense. So if you have, just for the sake of the argument, if you have an incorrect storm track that gave you incorrect coastal forcing, that you then downscaled and tried to somehow correct, you can't feed that back into the errors that you had in the storm track in the first place. So what do you have when you do that?
I don't know what to do, but I think it will be a total path that we should do, like feeding the global model with the regional ones to kind of correct those kind of interactions. So definitely we should move I guess. Or that would be beautiful.
But I think the other aspect of that is that there's a real cost to it, right? Now you've got this fully coupled system. If your intent is ecological forecasting for regional applications, I think the overarching driver is to try and provide that prediction or projection over a plausible range of ocean futures. So for me, recognizing that this one-way downscaling without full coupling is imperfect, the advantages of being able to more easily construct ensembles, albeit flawed in that way, I think far outweighs the two-way nesting. And there are two-way nesting papers out there, but when you review the literature, they're much more the exception than the norm. I think in large part because the motivation for that downscaling is less on trying to improve the global model, more on trying to understand what the regional implications of the global model are.
To change the subject, this is Dimitri Benemendes, and I have a quick question for Jessica Garwood and the Blair Witch Project. Why were there no eddies at 40 degrees north?
Well, that is a good question, and that is something that I will look into, and we can talk about it later. I think there may have not been enough time for the whole system to really have eddies everywhere, but also in the other experiments that I compared to, there is reduced eddies, probably also because of the grid scale, right? So they are smaller, so we're not probably capturing them. I wonder if going up in resolution we'll see more of that, but that is definitely the first thing I noticed as well.
Antonietta.
Antonietta Caputondi. I have a question for Matt. So in your, when we look at global models, I think you pointed out toward the end of your talk about sometimes models live in their own vicious world. So, and also during one of the breakout sessions, you pointed out the lack of observation to constrain biogeochemical models. So how realistic they are, which observation, if you could have anything you liked, which observation you would choose, what are the key variables that would really maybe
within a really constrained biogeochemical component?
That's a great question. I think so. One of the dominant constraints we use is sort of climatologies of large-scale nutrient distributions. That works reasonably well to kind of understand the mean state and the convolution of the flow with the biochemical source terms. But I think Colleen did a great job of sort of highlighting some of the deficiencies, trying to move these models to more ecosystem-focused applications. And in particular, we really lack, we lack observations at the global scale to constrain the mean, but it's worse when you try to think about dynamical processes that control the variability on a variety of time scales. And so, constituents of the ecosystem are really important. I think, building the models on a theoretical basis and considering them sort of plausible renditions of the processes that control the dynamics is useful, but ultimately we want to be able to predict reality, and so connecting to time-resolved observations is critical.
And I think a related question, I think you showed some very success stories in terms of predictions. So I didn't fully understand the scale of those predictions, if they were potential predictability, so you were trying to reproduce your baseline simulation, or they were actually applied to your observations?
Yeah, I showed results for both, but a lot of the biochemical results I showed were for potential predictability, in the sense that globally resolved observational estimates of net primary productivity or export production don't exist in a time-resolved sense. And so that's a key limitation for sure.
Quick follow-up question. Can you just explain what you mean by potential predictability, like in terms of the model predicting itself, or am I missing?
Yeah, I think the potential predictability is the model predicting itself, right? Basically, what are the timescales over which error growth in dynamical processes erases the memory condition versus sort of a skillful prediction compared to the model actually trying to predict the real world, and that's the speed is measured the real world. Exactly.
Any other?
Dimitri Menemendis again. Have you written a paper about this? Why? I didn't understand it, and I'd love to understand why a model is better at predicting the real world than itself. If there is, or if you can explain it in 3 sentences, or if there's a paper, I think it's really intriguing.
So I have not written on this, and the results I want to emphasize that are presented from our high-res analysis are from Steve Yeager at Ncar, and he's advanced the analysis of high-res. The signal-to-noise paradox is something that has been written about extensively in the climate modeling literature, and but it hasn't been resolved. And I think it has significant implications for our interpretation and faith in climate model solutions, in particular because it is indicative of something about the nature of the response of these models to forcing in the context of initial conditions or boundary condition forcing, and whether or not the indication is that the signal-to-noise ratio in the models is weak, and what that means is at this point speculative. I think the results I showed are, at least to my knowledge, the first indication that a high-resolution prediction system has the capacity to advance, or resolve this sort of signal-to-noise paradox. And that's super exciting because it relates to mesoscale dynamical processes in the ocean that somehow retain that predictive signal to a greater degree than the coarse resolution sort of linear ocean model.
So I have kind of just a response to this and another question for you. So that's not generally true that in certain areas. It basically boils down to whether the model is underconfident or overconfident in its probabilistic predictions. For ENSO, for example, models are typically overconfident. So they have the opposite of signal noise paradox. They predict themselves better than the real world, which is maybe what you might expect. And so in relation to that, yeah, you have a 40-member ensemble. So that's the question I asked Mike Jacobs yesterday. You got a 3-member ensemble. How reliable is the model? Because that's always the key with these forecast systems. If they're not reliable, if they don't predict probabilities correctly, then it's a probabilistic tool. They have to be adjusted.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And your point about it depends on which variable, which process you're looking at is, I agree with. But I think some of the indications of the requirement of having this very large ensemble to retain or to achieve any kind of skillful prediction is indicative of the noise in the simulation. How reliable are the models? I mean, some processes are completely omitted.
No, but I mean, it is the statistical. It's the standard thing with ensemble prediction. You basically plot when the model predicts a certain probabilistic category. How often does that occur, right? If the model typically predicts something's going to occur 20% of the time, it should be right 20% of the time. And it's this issue where sometimes a model could predict something's going to occur 20% of the time and it occurs 40% of the time, which would be underconfident, and that would be a signal and noise paradox problem. Or for like ENSO, where the model basically predicts 6 out of the last 3 El Niños. So that's the opposite problem. So that's what I was trying to get a sense of from.
Yeah, I don't have a general answer for that. But the thing that I'm curious about in particular is the opportunity for initialized prediction to shed light on some of these aspects. Because in the context of model development, one of the things that's done is sort of a validation process, focused, for instance, on dominant modes. Is ENSO variance predicted correctly, for example? And I think that might be, the initialized prediction might provide opportunities for more stringent tests of the model fidelity than sort of an evaluation of long-running control integrations, for example.
So I think this is getting us to, it's actually great that we're discussing this. It may sound like nuanced and deep in there, but it gets to this fundamental problem of getting predictions with fully specified uncertainties that are reliable. And so it really underpins where we need to get for ecological prediction. And the fact that we're wrestling with it, the fact we saw a few examples, Andrew's example from just previous, dealt with applying methodologies really developed in meteorology to try and sort of establish that reliability by taking not just the forecast ensemble, but then also the error statistics. I guess maybe a take home from this is we really need to kind of get together and get some best practices and make sure we're handing off products that are reliable estimates, be they dynamical, statistical, or otherwise. Is that fair to say, maybe? Matt, did you want to?
I would agree with that.
Okay, good.
And yeah, to your point about how do you, in a way, the best way to test some of these climate models is exactly to use them in a forecast mode. In fact, we've done that in a kind of a different sort of way, but we've looked at a lot of the CWS models and just that. But it also relates to Ethan, the last talk in the session, because when you dig these empirical techniques, at some level you're trying to reproduce the attractor of nature somehow, and in the models you try to reproduce the track record. In both cases, it's this idea of trying to test that analysis on some observed system. In a predictive sense, it's probably your hardest test.
So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I guess maybe if you permit me, that I was wrestling with something between the report outs that let us off today, and then these wonderful presentations that took us through this very rich toolbox that we have and continue to develop. And in the report outs, there are 2 bullets that seem like they're always there as report outs, right? We need data, and we lack mechanistic understanding, right? That's and oftentimes they're sort of put in almost an adversarial way to modeling, right? Like somehow we either invested in X or Y. And I often find myself when someone says this thing, yes, of course we need more data, of course we need more mechanistic understanding, but if we just dump investment in that blindly, we'll be doing it forever. And I mean, people mentioned zooplankton today. We had to blow back for 10 years on zooplankton, and we learned a lot. So obviously